All right, I just needed to find the record button. So now we are ready to go. So again, on behalf of the Engineering Change Lab USA Steering Committee and Board of Directors, welcome and thank you for taking part in our 11th summit. We sincerely hope that this virtual summit will come as close as possible to the learning environments that we experience in our in-person summits. And I want to extend a special welcome to those of you who are taking part in your first Change Lab Summit, and also to our provocateurs and for their help in this program. And hopefully you have reviewed my email from earlier today, which contains some important information regarding today's session. Okay, in 2019, Engineering Change Lab received a generous grant from NCEES that allowed us to go into operation. And in 2020, NCEES awarded us a second grant, and we are grateful for that support that they have provided. Thank you also to the companies that are listed on the slide who have stepped up to provide additional financial support. And in addition to their financial support, these companies represent the core stakeholders that make our work possible. This is our Engineering Change Lab USA Steering Committee and the group that founded the organization. Most of them are participating in today's event and are available to answer questions or listen to ideas about how we can enhance or expand our work. As a reminder, remember that the vision for Engineering Change Lab begins with the technological and environmental challenges of the future, like climate change, and the imperative for the engineering community to increase its contribution in addressing these challenges. From these come our mission to be a catalyst for change within the engineering community, helping it to reach its highest potential on behalf of society. An important aspect of our summits is challenging the status quo and provoking new ways of thinking about the future of engineering. To better define what this means, we have developed a provocateur's principle statement, which you have all received, and that is summarized on the slide. And I'm continuing to jump back and forth between admitting people and talking, so excuse me. We ask that everyone approach today's discussions with an openness to learning and to contributing to the discussion in a respectful manner. And if you've just joined, please remember to mute yourself. We're getting some interference. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kyle Davey, who is our creative director and lead facilitator. And Kyle's dedication to the work of Engineering Change Lab and his deep knowledge of the issues that we face and are exploring are invaluable. So Kyle, it's all yours.
All right, thanks, Mike. Pleasure to be with everyone again this morning. Wanted to remind people that as we start this, we will be working with really two windows this morning. We'll have the Zoom window, which I'm sure you're all looking at this point, but as well in going through the session, if you could open up that Google Doc link that we sent you, which has the workbook for the session. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen just briefly, give you the sense of that Google Doc. So the Google Doc is really set up to be the equivalent, it's a place to record the conversation and the inquiry as we go through the session. It operates very much like a flip chart, would be as if we're in person in terms of the session. So, and as we go through, it'll have the agenda And as we go through exercises or whatever, there will be the places for you to go in your breakout groups for you recording the results of your exercises as we go through them. Just a note on objectives in terms of this particular session is really focused on climate change as an imperative, one of the grand challenges for engineering. But the point of inquiry here is not really how to tackle that challenge per se, but rather to inquire about what is the role of the engineering community. What role, what responsibilities do they have with regard to addressing that challenge? And how might that activity over the coming decades and that work in terms of addressing climate change transform and change the engineering community, the way that engineers work during that period of time? And then finally, the second major objective, and we'll come to this closer to the end of the session, is to look at, the possibility, is there a noble purpose that really centers on climate change as an imperative for the engineering community that can be a rallying cry, and in the way that noble purposes can do inside organizations, be a point of gravity that can do work itself, pulling the initiatives that need to take place to address this forward. So those were our objectives setting up this session. As I say, principal ground rules here, just to keep in mind, we will have the chat running off to the side. That's been a pretty rich source of resources as well as commentary during the session. So if you can, pay attention to what's going on over in that window. We'll be using this Google Doc as a second screen where we'll be recording. And then, as I say, we'll be breaking out into a series of exercises. You'll be assigned group numbers, and there'll be a place inside the workbook to go to in terms of doing that work together. With regard to the agenda for today, we're going to mix a series of exercises with a set of provocateurs. And the way the provocateurs are arranged here is to telescope into or telescope our view toward what climate change is as an imperative and our thinking about engineers. We're going to start with the broad view with William Rouse, and we'll introduce each of these parties in more depth in just a moment, but we'll start with the broad view of climate change as that grand engineering challenge. Then what we decided to do with regard to this exercise to make it more, or this summit, in order to make it more concrete, was to focus on a real instance, and in this case, climate change, California, as the context and case study for our work. To set up that stage, we're pleased to have Andrew McAllister, a leader with the California Energy Commission, a member of that commission, to give us the overall frame with regard to climate change and the work that he's been engaged with from the California Energy Commission's perspective. Then we're going to move into two provocations that take a look at different sides of that. You can think that one side of addressing climate change has to do with decarbonization, roughly, and working in that arena. Dr. John Shin is with us to present, to talk about his perspective about, what that is going to require of the engineering community in terms of addressing climate change from that perspective. And then Heather Rock, who's the climate resiliency chief with PG&E, the Northern California utility, will talk about the adaptation and resilience side of that equation. We have to both adapt and become resilient while we are making this transition away from carbon. Then in the afternoon, Thelma Briseno will be with us to address a critical aspect of how we go about addressing climate change, which is doing it in a way that also addresses the social justice and environmental justice side of the equation. Hopefully remediating some of the harm that has happened in the past with regard to those issues and the environment and the energy systems that we have in the country, but also how do we make this transition in a way that makes the situations better, that results in a more just, more equal world for us as we move forward. So Thelma will be our fifth provocateur. In between those provocations, we'll have a series of exercises, a quickie to start off with that we'll move into in just a moment. Then we'll have a more extended exercise exploring the future, which will be a backcasting sort of strategic thinking exercise. And then a final exercise in the afternoon that will focus on that idea of a noble purpose. So that's where we're going with regard to the agenda. And without further ado, I think I want to move into this first exercise, which is really just designed to get everyone focused in what are we dealing with in terms of climate change as an imperative. And so if you would go to, in your Google Books, you can turn to page 5 there. Basic instructions here, we're going to put you into small groups, and we're going to ask each small group to find their group number on the following pages. And you're going to be given 4 different major global risks that may be present in the future. And your job, and we're going to give you about 10 minutes to do this inside your small groups, is to determine which of those 4, the set that your group was given, is the most significant global risk. And you can do it in that classic way of both assessing likelihood and impact, and then determining, well, which of the 4, from your perspective, seems to be the most significant. So each group is going to be given a different set as you see through that. Mike is going to put you into those breakout groups. When you do, please move to the material or that set that are there for that group number that you're in. We're going to give you about 10 minutes. When you get into that small group, if you could choose one person to be your discussion leader and one person to be your recorder to work on the Google Doc, that would be terrific for our purposes. When you get there as well, if the 4 or 5 people that are in each of the groups can just very briefly introduce themselves to each other, this is also a way of beginning to make connections inside our group this morning. And then you will have 10 minutes to do that work. So with that, Mike, and then we'll come back and we'll report out, which of the global risks did your group determine in your set was most significant. With that, Mike, I think we're ready to go. If you want to go ahead and move people into their breakout groups.
Okay, here you go, everyone.
And I'll stop sharing. The first day's play or whatever, that there were only out of 20, tens of thousands of people in one group of brackets or whatever, there were only 128 that still had viable brackets for an undefeated, to choose them all.
Good enough.
Hey, William, did you just join us? Oh, no, we switched.
All right. Do we have everybody back, Mike?
Mute everyone.
Yeah, if you can mute and let
Yeah, it looks like
on.
everybody's here, Kyle.
All right, so I want to say this is really just designed as a quick opening exercise. We're not going to sample everybody in terms of which of the ones that you determine, but I do want to just do a few. And so if you'll allow me, when I call your group, if someone from your group could let us know what was the most significant one that was, which group were you in, and what was the most significant global risk from your perspective of the set that you were given. And so let's start with group 6. Somebody can be a spokesperson for that group very quickly.
And unmute.
Yeah, sorry, I was on double mute there. Apologies. So for group 6, let me just scroll back up on the Google Docs. We listed most of these things, as you can see, as they're all 4 or 5 because our perspective is they're all happening now. So the likelihood of them happening in the next 10 years remains high. And then the impact, you can see, we've caveated some of them, particularly the climate action failure. While we think the impact in the next 10 years is only a 3, longer term, it would be much higher. But where we ended up, if you're just looking at the numbers, is the cybersecurity failure was the highest in terms of combined likelihood and impact.
All right, very good, thank you. And let's see, group number 9.
Okay, this is J.R. Reddish. We looked at the likelihood and impact of all those items there. Weapons of mass destruction seemed to jump out at us most significantly. Obviously, the impact with the COVID-19, that's a virus, went around the globe pretty quick. So we thought that the impact was high. The likelihood, we placed it 4. Extreme weather, we're seeing that. Vince, one of our participants from California, I'm here in Texas. We've seen direct impact of severe weather in both of our locations, and the likelihood is obviously very high and the impact is high. So the most significant global risk, obviously we're dealing with one right now called COVID-19. A biological weapon could be easily deployed and cause grave concern for all of us.
Okay, thank you, JR. Okay, group 13.
Good morning, Mike Stats from MSA here.
Hi, Mike.
So we had a good discussion on that, and the one item that we thought was really important there, we were kind of split between 2: IT infrastructure breakdown and just the importance of how we run our companies. Everything's IT, and if that breaks down, boy, that's going to have a huge impact. But we also spent a fair amount of time talking about biodiversity loss, and that seemed to, for our group, to come up to the top, even though the IT infrastructure was a close second. With the biodiversity loss, if our world starts losing that biodiversity, there might be bigger issues than our IT infrastructure. So we went with biodiversity loss.
Okay, thank you, Mike. And then finally, let me just check here. Yes, group 19.
So for the highest likelihood, we selected the debt crisis, seeing as it impacts us personally, professionally, drives funding for engineering work that we do. Impact, because of the immediate nature of it, we had terrorist attacks as the highest. And strangely, just based on the previous comment about biodiversity, Dan kind of brought us back up on that, but we had that as a lower ranking. So it sounds like we are coming from different angles on this, which is helpful.
All right, good. Well, thanks. Let me share my screen. So this opening exercise was really, to get a frame for thinking about climate change and the risks that make it an imperative, if you will, in terms of addressing it. One way to think about those risks is provided by the World Economic Forum. And each year, the World Economic Forum surveys a set of about 650 people that are in their global leadership team of different forums and different stakeholder groups that they have that come from both private and government. And, they're in that survey asking them, what do they consider to be the most significant risks? What's the risk landscape globally at any particular, for any particular year? The results of their latest survey for 2021 are shown on this graph.
Hey, Kyle, did you see the note to make your screen bigger?
Yeah, I was just doing that now.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay, so you can see that with regard to likelihood and impact, as you look at the landscape they provide, and this will change a little bit year to year if you look at the past assessments that they've done. But if you look at the current one that they said, infectious diseases, certainly representing the notion of the pandemic, is suddenly, raised to the top there. If you would have looked at that one in 2020, actually, it would have been down in the middle range in terms of people's thoughts about the possibility of a pandemic. But we learned things, we experienced things, so that's now quite high. But the set that have been consistently in the high range over the last number of years include this one: climate action failure, the failure to take action with regard to climate in an early enough fashion; biodiversity loss, which one of the groups just talked about; human environmental damage; extreme weather; and other forms of natural resource crises. That in all of those, you could argue, touch on this idea of climate change and climate and related aspects of that. And I think it just reinforces the notion why this focus on climate change as a grand engineering challenge presents itself, and why the work on that is so significant, and really is the context for this session. What is the engineer's role with regard to addressing that grand challenge? And how might the act of addressing it over the next decades change and transform the engineering community itself? What kind of impact might that have on our community as we do that good work on behalf of society? So to go a little bit deeper with regard to that view from an engineer's perspective, we want to turn it over to the first of our provocateurs, and that's Bill Rouse. Now, Bill comes to us, he's currently on faculty with Georgetown University in Washington, DC. He sits in their public policy group, although he's an engineer by trade training, and really comes at his work, I think, with a perspective that emphasizes a systems view, systems analysis, works a lot with using computer analysis and modeling to help public policy groups, private groups address complex problems that society faces. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill and his perspective about addressing this grand challenge of engineering that we have in front of us. Thanks, Bill.
Okay, now I'm going to try to share my screen. Share, okay. Is that working?
It is.
It is.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to go to slideshow. So we'll get some more space up here. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the complexity of climate change and the challenges it presents to us. Let's see, is it going to let me change slides? There we go. This is a favorite slide I have when I try to present things that are a little controversial. And you can see that Bill's comments didn't necessarily get very well received in this presentation. So I realize I'm going to probably say a few things that not everybody will agree with. I don't know. Oh, I see it's down here. Okay. So first, we're going to just talk about Earth as a system, climate versus weather, some recent examples that things are really happening. And we're going to then talk about who are the stakeholders in these things and what is their perspective. We'll talk a little bit about potential interventions, and we'll talk about the whole notion of immersing the stakeholders in the complexity of climate change and letting them experience it computationally. I developed this model when I was chairing a National Academy of Science committee on the impact of global population. And I was trying to see how all the different pieces from the different participants fit together. And there are two observations I think that are important with this. One is these different four pieces of the system do not operate on the same time scale. And so some things have time constants that are decades. Some things have time constants that are weeks or months. And that's part of the conflict underlying dealing with the Earth as a system, because we have different perspectives on what and when things matter. To be more specific, people tend to have temporal discount rates. In other words, they discount things far into the future substantially, and are not necessarily oriented towards long-term investments when I first put this together, I asked some of my colleagues, a whole bunch of colleagues, one at a time, would you be willing to forego education of your children if you could bring the Earth's temperature down by 1 degree in 100 years? And no one agreed to that. Their time constant associated with their education of their children is dominant. Not that they don't care about the other things. The other thing is a spatial discount rate. People tend to discount things that are not happening close to them. And the classic example is that a child dying in your neighborhood is a tragedy. 100,000 people dying halfway around the world is a statistic. Okay, and so the question of how these segments of the system relate to each other is very important. We've tended to break it down in the following way, where we look at the level from people, processes, organizations, and society. And we actually develop computational models of how these pieces fit together so we can explore what if scenarios. And I'll come back in a little bit as to sort of how do we do that. What's the overall physics of what we're dealing with? And this comes from the US Weather Service. I didn't make this up, but this is all the different chemicals, processes, temperatures, gases, et cetera. They're involved with climate. And so it is really rather complicated. And it doesn't listen to reason. You can't tell it that he should do things differently. It just is. And that's an important point. I'll come back to that in a bit later. So what's the evidence that this matters? Well, these are all reports I've put together that are kind of interesting. As sea levels rise, some places can't be saved. That is a statement from the state of Florida. When they look at raising the roads through the Florida Keys to be able to make the roads drivable with sea level rise, it comes out their projection is about $500,000 per resident to do it. And the state has said, we just can't afford it. We're not going to be able to do it. Some of you people are going to be living on islands. Owners of coastal homes no longer able to get 30-year mortgages because the mortgage companies aren't sure about the 30-year time horizon for these homes. People unable to afford increasingly flood insurance because as the flood insurance gets more and more expensive, they can't. Melting roads requiring application of additional rubberized layers with the result that quite a few trucks can't make it under the bridges, which is really very disruptive, as you imagine. All know about the 20 or 30 million acres in California that need to be cleared of combustible tinder. Very, very expensive undertaking. Fishermen up in the Northeast catching fish that are unrecognizable because they come from southern waters and no one actually wants these fish. And the most extreme is preceding the National Academy of Science report, so heavily reviewed, that came out, that the southeast and southwest of the US will be uninhabitable in 20 to 40 years. There'll be mass migrations north. These are all things happening right now. I know some of our predictions, if the Greenland ice cap melts, this was in the paper just the other day, if it melts, and there's a good reason to believe it will melt because they found fossilized plants at the bottom of it, which means that ice cap wasn't always there. And it's come, and so it could go again. If the Greenland ice cap melts, sea level rise will be 20 feet around the world. So there's plenty of reasons to be worried right now. And these are not hypothetical outcomes. Well, who are the stakeholders? Now, one of the problems with this whole arena is there are so many stakeholders, so many organizations involved that have an opinion, have a stake in the solution, have investments, have employment, et cetera. And so it's really complicated to think about how to deal with all of these stakeholders. And what's their perspective? Well, elected officials have great difficulty trading off short-term and long-term costs and benefits due to a large extent the concerns of their constituents. But this is not just climate change. I mean, look at public infrastructure. We know what to do, we just don't invest. We wait till the bridges fall down, then we build a new one. Organizations have vested interests in energy extraction, refinement. They're naturally inclined to sustain the status quo. The processes for extracting, refining, and utilizing fossil fuels are well developed. They employ millions of people and represent trillions of dollars of market capitalization. And we're going to try to disrupt that. That's going to take some thinking. And then people have long exploited natural resources and come to enjoy the benefits of these resources in terms of consumption and employment. Changing these habits is going to be very difficult. It's going to require investment in order to get people to take different kinds of jobs. Now, the good news is the Bureau of Labor Statistics in terms of employment, the top 10 jobs, growth jobs in the country are 4 in technology and 6 in healthcare. Okay. 2 of the technology ones is solar panel installation and wind turbine maintenance. These are good paying jobs, but of course, people need the skilled training to be able to do these jobs. So what do we do? So we started looking at potential interventions, both to mitigate global warming and then to mitigate the impacts of global warming. So we did this as a policy analysis, and we looked at each intervention and we looked at the mechanisms whereby you could make the intervention. In other words, does it require law? Does it require investments? Does it just require communication? Okay. And so the left column, not surprisingly, decrease fossil fuels, decrease methane emissions, eliminate coal-fired plants, increase renewable, invest in home efficiency, invest in clean energy public transit, transition to clean jobs, have jobs that are associated with all these things, increase education for clean jobs. I did a projection of the future of work and was concerned, the question raised was, well, is AI and automation going to put everybody out of work? And all of my projections show that there'll be more new jobs created than old jobs eliminated, drawing on a whole bunch of different sources. However, the question is, how do we train people to do those jobs? And my projection is we will need to triple the capacity of community colleges in order to do that. That's a really major investment. And then increased consumption of plant-based foods and increase in reforestation. The mitigating the impacts, you see over here, it is quite different. Deterring building in floodplains, encourage flood proofing for both homes and businesses, invest in dikes and levees, invest in wetlands to absorb hurricanes, invest in means to project where the water will be. During Hurricane Sandy, one of my colleagues, who's an urban oceanographer, had projected that the water would be about 12 feet higher than normal. And what he found was that that was just an abstraction to people. What does 12 feet higher than normal mean? So finally what he did is he gave people projections of where the water would be in their house, a pictorial presentation of where the water would be in their house. That caused them to act once they saw that. Raising roads to enable continuity of access. How do we deal with high temperatures and fires? And we need to get the whole population, starting in K through 12, to understand all about climate change, about weather, about the need for these investments. We've done a lot of work at the Academy in trying to recruit young women to engineering. And over the 25 years of this program, we've discovered the best way to recruit women to engineering is to start in middle school. If you wait till the end of high school, it's too late. They didn't take the courses to prepare them. They're not oriented. And so now we're working on a whole issue of how to get people more interested in STEM fields much earlier. And then invest in jobs and training. So all of this could be really very positive economically if we're willing to come up with a plan and do it. So how do we do this? This is an example of what we call the immersion lab. This is screens 8 feet, 20 feet wide, semicircle. And this actually is a simulation of the health system of New York City. and the stakeholders are in the room. The man in the upper left is the CEO of Accenture. And we're actually simulating the whole health system of the city and letting people experiment. And often when we have smaller groups just of leaders from these systems, they're up in the semicircle and they're trying things. They're changing assumptions, they're moving sliders, they're changing set points and whatever to see how it plays out. And even though we had the CEOs of major healthcare systems in this from New York City, and you'd think they would know this system cold, right? They were all continually discovering things they didn't realize about their own system. They just never looked at it. And I think we've done the same thing for transportation, electric vehicles, and autonomous cars. We've done a similar one for higher education and the dynamics, the economics of higher education. And this really gets people involved. And I think that's what you have to do with stakeholders and get them involved. Let them take the wheel. Let them make some assumptions. Let them see what's going to happen. And these screens, by the way, although they're vertical rather than horizontal, is the same screen John King uses when he talks about the election returns. We bought the same screens he has, except we've got 7 of them. And so you can imagine doing this on CNN when there's call in and people can say, what happens if we did this? What happens if we did that? And we get people engaged, and we get them engaged starting in K through 12 throughout their life. So I've got one parting thought, and this was the title of a blog I did for Oxford University Press. And this is an interesting challenge compared to the pandemic. There is not going to be any vaccine for sea level rise. Okay? It's not like we can find the secret pill and it just go away. We're going to have to deal with it. Now, interestingly, from the Academy of Engineering's point of view, we're basically saying we value science. We value what science finds. We value the explanations that science develops. But in order to take care of the problem, you need engineering. You don't just want to study the problem. You want to fix the problem or mitigate the problem. And that's the role that engineering could play. And one final thing, The Bridge is the magazine of the National Academy of Engineering. And the URL at the bottom is how to get to that magazine. It's free. You can just download it. And this has something like 60 essays on complexity of education, complexity of healthcare, complexity of the environment, complexity of race relations, et cetera. So you might find it fun. Each article is like 2 pages. But I just put that up as an offer to maybe intrigue you with the different views of complexity. And that's my story.
All right. Thank you, Bill. We've got time for just 1 or 2 questions. If anybody wants to pop forward with a question, unmute yourself.
And Bill, you can stop your screen sharing when you can. There's a question in the chat. If you can see that,
Mike.
Bill.
Okay, I'm gonna go look.
Could you narrate it, Mike?
Yeah, Bill, the question is from Bob Sims. You did not mention the important potential for nuclear power for energy generation to replace fossil fuels. Why was that omitted?
I agree with you completely with the potential for nuclear power. I've been very close to this, worked in the industry for many years with some of our tools. I just didn't decide to include it, but I agree with you completely.
Thank you.
Bill, I have a question. Where is the immersion lab located? Is it still in use?
Yeah, it's at Stevens up in Hoboken, New Jersey, but we're in the process of building one at Georgetown, and we will be across the street from Congress.
Ah, okay.
Okay, because we wanted to be able to make it so that staff members of House and Senate committees could come see things, not just get PowerPoint slides.
Hi, William.
All right.
Stephanie Hamilton from NSPE. I was just curious, in your presentation, you mentioned the need to triple capacity of community colleges in order to train people. And I'm curious why the focus on community colleges as opposed to 4-year universities, if there was a purpose behind that.
Well, there's a very interesting report from I think it's the National Science Board last year, on the skilled technical workforce. And they project huge growth among people who need solid technical skills, but they don't need degrees in engineering. It's more training, it's more hands-on. They're going to be able to really do things. And so that comes from there, that the 2-year degree at a community college probably can provide the training to get the skilled technical worker into the training that the company or the agency will provide. That doesn't mean that a bachelor's degree is bad. It just means it's not necessary for many of these jobs.
Interesting, thanks.
By the way, my son works for Subaru now, and he went through automotive technology in upstate New York in the community college. The total degree cost me $5,000.
All right. With that, thank you, Bill, in terms of getting us started, looking at the big system. And, particularly, I'm just a tremendous fan of what you're doing with regard to that immersion lab idea and the ability to put stakeholders together in an environment where they can, play with all of that data and model and learn together in terms of making some of those critical decisions, but having some of those critical insights.
There are 2 principles I might mention that maybe I should have brought up earlier. One is, rather than you and I arguing together about what will work or not work, why don't we together argue with the model?
Right.
And get it up on the screen, try it. The second thing is, people say, well, how do you know the predictions are going to be true? And of course we don't. We know these are possible futures. But one thing we've discovered, and the stakeholders have told us repeatedly, this is really a great way to get rid of bad ideas quickly.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Bill. So now, from that big picture in terms of looking at the global perspective about climate change and the possibility, the threats that it presents, but also the possibilities in terms of how do we move forward to address it. I want to be specific with our work today, looking at the role the engineering community can play addressing it by looking at California and considering California as a case study and context for thinking about that. And our choice of California really was driven by the observation that California has been a leader with regard to addressing climate change for now decades. This work is long-standing as an imperative for the state, generating a whole set of legislative initiatives that have happened over time, and lots of good work over those decades. But the recognition in California that the work, the heavy lifting on that work is probably still ahead of us. So to really look at that notion of California as context and case study, we're pleased to have Andrew McAllister, who is in his second round or a second tour of duty or term with the California Energy Commission as a leader on that commission. He particularly leads with regard to their work on energy efficiency and energy assessments, comes from a long involvement with regard to public policy and energy policy in terms of his background. So with that, Andrew, I'm going to turn it over to you and allow you to pull up your screen for sharing. Thank you.
All right. Well, great. Well, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. Let me see if I can pull my screen up here. Okay. I think that's got it. And then I'll go into presentation mode here. Can you guys see my whole presentation? Oh, sorry. I meant to go all the way up here. Sorry, there you go.
Yeah, it looks good, Andrew.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for the opportunity. It's really great to be here. I'm going to keep this pretty high level. Hopefully I can zoom through this and maybe we can do some questions, because I think there are, this is current events. I mean, we're talking, long-term climate change, but for California, it's the real deal. We're living it every day, and policy is evolving just day by day. I mean, when we had the fires last August, that triggered a whole series of events that we had fires, and then we also, alongside that, and partially related at least, we had power outages that you all heard about. And that has just triggered, I think, a really, not that the discussion wasn't very robust already, but the reality of living climate change and how many Californians it's affecting on a daily basis has really it's just put this conversation on steroids. And so our policy environment is evolving very quickly. And it's providing, I think, a lot of oxygen to the conversation, let's say, in the context of our innovation economy. And so already we have the 5th largest economy in the world. We've got a massive amount of venture capital. We have a lot of smart people in these agglomerations of urban areas, Silicon Valley and growing in Southern California, LA, San Diego, as well, in different areas of the clean tech economy. And so it really is kind of, obviously you can't say it's a good thing, climate change, but it definitely has, I think, provided an amazing synergy in terms of just the urgency, really, the urgency that's driving our conversation. So I'm going to keep this pretty high level, like I said. So, this is it. I mean, 4% of our state burned in 2020. I mean, we had 10,000 fires. They burned over 10,000, around 10,000 structures, 4.2 million acres. The August complex fire gave rise to a new term, the gigafire. Just the dynamics of those fires is new and different. And that fire itself alone was burned more than 1 million acres across 7 counties, an area bigger than Rhode Island. So on August 19th, Governor Newsom gave a talk that really, in August and September, actually gave a series of talks, and it culminated in the declaration of a climate dam emergency. And that's really how all the agencies, he asked all the agencies to do everything they can to redouble their efforts to really focus on climate change and work that into all of our policies across the board in any way we can. And so we're doing that in a bunch of different ways, and I won't even talk about all of them here. But I oversee, as was said there, energy efficiency, our building code, and much of our energy analysis. And so we're using data in a lot of interesting ways. We do control the energy piece of the California Building Code. We do regulate appliance efficiency. We do a lot of very pragmatic, proactive things that actually influence tremendously how we utilize energy and therefore the emissions from that energy use. So I'm going to talk about a few of those things. So this is, maybe some of you have seen this, many of you probably, but we are actually, there is a positive message, that climate change can be very bleak in terms of figuring out the long-term prospects, and the models are not happy reading in terms of where they predict that we're going to go, and the range of possibility in terms of our emissions trajectories, in terms of the impacts of our emissions going forward. And we're seeing definitely that the impacts are in line or even a little bit worse than the average with that science has sort of said was the consensus. So we're getting, in different ways, we're getting these impacts. But our economy is growing. Our population has been growing somewhat slower than historically, but still growing. And our greenhouse gas emissions in absolute terms have actually gone down quite a bit since 1990 levels. They've gone down a bit since 2000, as you see here. This is a little bit dated, but the trends have continued since 2017. And per capita, our emissions are down a lot, and per GDP, they're down a great amount. The thing is, the climate is in absolute terms. That's what it's interested in. So we do have to continue to decrease the emissions in absolute terms, and that's what our policies are trying to do. I can't say that anybody in the globe has been completely successful, but we're doing a lot of different things to try to move the needle even faster than we have been. So these are a number of our overarching goals, and all of these are either in statute, have been embodied in a law that's been passed and signed into law by the governor, either Governor Brown, the previous governor, Governor Newsom, our current governor, or in one or two cases an executive order. But we do have these goals, and so they're all complementary: doubling efficiency savings, 60% renewable electricity by 2030, and 100% carbon-free electricity by 2045. We're actually ahead of schedule on both of those goals. Decarbonize our industrial processes. That's very, our buildings and our industrial processes. I'm working very actively on the building side of this, and I can talk a little bit about that. Electrify transportation. We have an executive order that has, from Governor Newsom from last year, that has targeted 2035 for eliminating the sales of internal combustion engines. So all zero emission vehicles in passenger vehicles. And then we're doing similarly bold things, I would say, in the medium and heavy duty. So there's a lot of activity in the transportation sector, which is overall 40% of our emissions in California. The whole Governor Brown, on the lower right, you'll see this carbon-free economy by 2045. That's an executive order from Governor Brown. It still carries the force of law. And so we're, that's a much broader thing than just the energy sector. And then the blue box in the middle of the bottom there provide equitable low carbon solutions for low income residents and disadvantaged communities. This is something that is front and center in all of our policies now. And so it's quite interesting in terms of when you actually, about 35–40% of our state is in a disadvantaged community or low income. Many families individually would be in both. And targeting policies, crafting policies that actually take that as a first principle rather than an afterthought actually does really change how you invest. And I think that's important to acknowledge. Not that we've got the solution, but I think there is incredible imperative to focus on solutions that don't leave the least of us behind. And so that's on the jobs front, and it's on the actually taking advantage of the technologies themselves, right? So it's full participation in the clean energy economy. And I'll just say, California's clean energy economy already employs about 500,000 people. And of those, about 300,000 are in energy efficiency. So the trades, the traditional trades, swinging them to energy efficiency. And we can talk about the fuel mix, because that's a pretty controversial topic in terms of natural gas and electricity and how they're going to evolve, co-evolve going forward. But the jobs can be a very positive impact of a set of policies that really do favor climate, that take it seriously, that do favor both mitigation and adaptation, both of which you'll be hearing about more today. So I think there's a very large upside actually to transitioning our economy to zero carbon. Let's see. Okay, there we go. So California is already a very efficient economy. We started the push with energy efficiency in the mid-70s, and California sort of started that ball rolling. We do have a mild climate, but we started the building codes back then, the appliance standards. We started really looking at efficiency as an alternative to new capacity, traditional supply. And so you'll see the difference, the divergence between California and the United States. And the US as a whole has sort of also over time adopted these same approaches. So flattened out around 2000 or so. And actually the US as a whole is starting to trend downward now, but we've been flat per capita electricity demand since the mid-70s. I wanted to talk about just a few initiatives that we've got going that are notable. Senate Bill 100, it expands the renewables portfolio standard. It's the one that's 60% by 2030 and then 100% carbon-free by 2045. We've just, I don't have the link here, but we've just released the final SB 100 first edition. This is a long-term effort. Every 4 years we'll be updating this report, but you can go look at it, and it runs a bunch of scenarios about what 100% carbon-free is likely to look like over time and how we get there. And the upshot is that we're going to have to install huge amounts of renewables, around 6 gigawatts, mostly solar. We're also going to have to invest in new technologies that can be zero carbon baseload and a bunch of sort of iterations of that. It was, as I said, it was scenario driven. So we need lots of storage and we need lots of renewables. And the details of how much and when vary kind of by the scenario. But we did a no combustion scenario. We did actually a load flexibility scenario, and I'm going to talk about load flexibility a little bit. But we did a scenario that basically says if you have a lot of flexible resources, it gives you much more ability to keep costs down and to minimize your investment in storage, which is kind of interesting. So over time, we are being successful. This is the CAISO, this is the California Independent System Operator carbon content of our electricity. And you can see year by year, it's trending downward. When you have an adverse weather event, that's a barrier. So some of these bumps in the road, like in 2018, we had a heat wave and a lot of natural gas had to come online to that June, July, August, September time period can be challenging. When you have to put on a bunch of thermal power plants, that sort of doesn't help your carbon content. So can we do that with renewable gas? That's an open question. Can we do that with non-carbon gas sources, hydrogen mixes and things like that? Open question. But we do know that we have to really amp up the renewables in order to keep this trend going downward. And this is just CO2 per, actually this is absolute terms in CO2, so. So again, I guess just to emphasize the climate change, and the outages this past August really were an unprecedented heat wave. That's the many years in the past, over like I think the last 20 years or so, the peak temperatures in each day of August. So this past one was definitely it was west wide, and so it was difficult across the West, and we need to be ready for that when it happens again, because it will happen again. So maintaining reliability in the electric sector is just job one. Governors in California have lost their jobs over this. You'll remember in the early 2000s when we had blackouts that were much more serious than the ones in August. We actually kind of pulled the rabbit out of the hat last August. It could have been much worse, but we were able to get a bunch of resources online and really shore things up in the last few days of that heat wave. Nowhere near as big as what happened in Texas. They were on the other end of the stick. The Arctic temperatures came down, and they were not prepared. They had not weatherized largely their natural gas infrastructure for those kinds of temperatures. And you all saw what happened. So planning for reliability is job one if you're running an electric grid. So all of these topics, build more in-state resources, demand forecasts. So we have done for our entire existence, and I oversee the demand forecast. And that is a hugely analytical task. It's very collaborative with all the other energy agencies in California, the ISO and the Public Utilities Commission, and the Air Resources Board, actually, increasingly. And I think it's an example for other places. It's relatively complex. A state as large as California can do a really comprehensive demand forecast independently from the utilities, but not all states can do that. And we've been doing a lot of work with other states on that I'm happy to talk about. But forecasting and reliability assessments are key data-driven information about your system. And that's a theme across any of these topics. We need better and more data, and we need the skills to be able to use it. The final thing I'll note here, and I've just got a few more slides to wrap up, establish a process to allow distributed energy resources and load flexibility to actively support grid reliability. So prosumer is a term that some of you may have heard, but the actual participation of the user of energy in the to underpin and enhance the reliability of the grid by being flexible and by generating and doing things at the distribution system level that is a fact that is coming. That is an idea whose time has come. And so we're doing a lot to cultivate load flexibility in California. So just to put a point on, electricity obviously has to be managed in the moment. The carbon content of electricity varies moment by moment. And you can tell in the early summer when the loads are low and we have lots of solar and lots of renewables, relatively low carbon content on the grid. At nighttime and in the colder months, obviously we have a higher carbon content. So we really need our policies to help us take that butter knife and spread all this out all over, sort of take the green and spread it out all over the other hours. And so partly that's storage, but partly that's load flexibility. We still burn a lot of natural gas in our buildings. I'm going to talk a little bit here about our buildings before I wrap up. About half of the energy use in our buildings is natural gas. If you count those carbon molecules, that will, and if you don't get rid of those carbon molecules and if you don't stop emitting them into the atmosphere, you're not reaching your carbon goals. That's just a fact. You count, that's just math. And so we have to electrify. At the same time, as I said, we're going to be decarbonizing our electric grid. So that's the big plan in California. We will have some thermal loads left. So this is an ongoing, really initial conversation about what happens to the natural gas supply grid. But it's clear that we have to decarbonize it in some fashion. And that's either move to electricity entirely or reduce the amount of fossil gas in the gas system and go wholly towards renewables like renewable hydrogen, biogas, and things of that nature. And so it really matters actually what you do with your buildings. If we're going to get to zero by 2045, we actually haven't even figured out a scenario that's going to get us there in the building sector. And if the baseline gets us maybe halfway there, not quite, these various scenarios, renewable gas helps, but it won't really get us there. Electrification scenarios are the ones that really get us there. And this aggressive electrification scenario is essentially every new building as of 2030 is all electric. And every new replacement, almost every replacement of an existing HVAC or water heater is electric. Most of them are gas right now. And then we actually go into buildings and aggressively replace them before their lifetime is up as well, like 20, 30%, I think is that scenario. So that's what a policy that's actually trying to decarbonize looks like. It's investing, pushing policies that shift us very aggressively and muscularly toward zero carbon resources at every opportunity we can. And in our buildings, that means building them electric, and it means making the vast majority of our replacements of gas appliances electric as well. So if you can imagine what that means for each building and each community, the work that contractors would be getting to do that, I mean, that's a massive undertaking, but it's lots of jobs, as I said. So the future is flexible. I think that's I've already sort of given you that point, but I think this idea of participants of reliability being enhanced by participation of the loads themselves, the customers. It needs an ecosystem and a value proposition that's going to let it scale and really help us keep costs down, optimize the grid, its utilization, and also decarbonize and keep reliability up. So I believe this is my last slide. So California has a way, so I've talked about a couple of specific things, the electric grid and our buildings, just as an example of the kinds of policies that we put in place. We've also obviously transportation, I mentioned that. All of these pieces add up to a decarbonizing trend in our economy.
Andrew, I don't think the slide advanced.
Oh, it didn't? Let's see. What are you seeing right now? Fostering?
Energy use in buildings.
Oh, interesting. Okay, let me see here. You see it now?
No.
Oh, interesting. Okay, let me see. So I've got, you have a pie chart?
Yeah, energy use in buildings pie chart.
Oh,
yeah.
geez. Okay, so let me see here. I'm going to stop and restart my screen.
Yeah, right. That's
okay. Let me just, there it is. Okay, do you see my screen anew?
It's coming, I think.
Okay, say that again.
We don't see your screen yet. It says you've started screen sharing.
Well, I'm seeing everything good from my side, and it says I am screen sharing, so I'm not sure exactly where to go. I was several slides forward from apparently where it stopped.
Well, I would just go ahead and finish up. Yeah.
I would go ahead and just do it verbally right now, Andrew.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Let's see. I guess so I've talked, about buildings and transportation and the electric sector on which we will depend to decarbonize. And then the last thing I'll say is we invest and this is unique to California. We have a very strong public-private partnership kind of program approach. And so we invest about $200 million a year in energy-related research. It's our RD&D, research, development, demonstration, and deployment. And the core mission of that investment is to invest funds to catalyze change and accelerate the achievement of our policy goals. And so that money goes out, and it's doing a lot of innovative things. And every sort of, many of you, many of you are familiar with Everett Rogers' work on the diffusion of innovation and the Valley of Death, and kind of these whole commercialization approaches, that are proven, and I think we're doing that in a lot of different realms in California. But the inventing the widget, and I'll just link it to the engineering, curricula. The inventing the widget, and even doing the basic research and developing some technology that could be commercializable, that is absolutely critical, right? We invest a lot, and together with the federal government, which really is even more on the basic research front. We have national labs that we work with a lot. But getting the approach, getting the practice, proving out the idea, that's the first step. But then we have to commercialize. We have to demonstrate, we have to evaluate and validate, and then continue to invest in a promising idea to get it really through to commercialization and get it to scale. And so we've done that on a lot of different fronts, on buildings, on generation technologies, on both electricity and natural gas energy consumption. Just many on agricultural, we're doing a lot of investments, microgrids, battery technologies, just across the board of the technologies that are going to get us to our zero carbon goals. And so, as I said, it's about $200 million a year. Sounds like a lot, but the private sector capital that's needed to really get those technologies to the market at scale really are not coming from the state. But the policies have to align with that and incentivize that. And so we've got a lot of experience in California doing that. And I think it makes me optimistic that we're going to be able to accelerate our carbon reductions. Obviously, it's difficult when we have an economic downturn and priorities shift, and particularly if we have a budget deficit, that sort of thing. That's just reality of politics. But over time, we're showing that we can do this consistently. And so I think as the upside, and certainly the public health benefits and all the other corollary benefits, job creation, et cetera, start to become clear. And hopefully, we'll get a handle on some of our other difficult problems, like the housing crisis that we have in California. I think we'll have the conditions to actually really continue to move the needle on carbon emissions. And with that, so
we got your slide back. So
there you go.
Yeah, we did.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, really? Okay. So you're seeing empowerinnovation.net.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
I thought this was a good slide to end up with, because we have that $200 million a year of investment actually has generated a large community of entrepreneurs in the energy space, and it's much of the information that's been produced over the last decade and a half, couple decades. Much of that is up on this Empower Innovation site, and for researchers and entrepreneurs and startups that are looking for teammates, for funding, for community to kind of bounce ideas around with. Energyinnovation.net. It's relatively new, but that's the idea, that it has resources and tools for folks to figure out how to move forward with their idea. We need all the creativity we can get, and we want to create all the synergies that we can as we go forward. So with that, I will stop sharing. I believe that is my last slide.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, great.
Thank you, Andrew. Just a couple quick questions. Dwight Miller who was with Parametrics, an engineering firm up in the Northwest, primarily, asked a question about California has historically obtained power from the Pacific Northwest in the summer. With warming summer temperatures and summer needs in the Pacific Northwest, how will this impact California? And is nuclear in California's future? I will note that Lauren Evans, who resides part-time in Arizona, asked ditto with regard to Arizona and the Palo Alto nuclear plant there. So how is California connected out with other places whose climate is changing as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, this is not just California. This is a West-wide problem. The California Independent System Operator actually is now the Grid Reliability Coordinator. Actually, they wear another hat now, the Grid Reliability Coordinator for the entire WEC, the Western Interconnect. And so So we actually have a lot of insight, and we're doing increasingly coordination. I actually represent California on the Western Interstate Energy Board and a couple of other entities. And we're all worried about the same things. And we're all studying the same things. We're pooling resources to really look at the reliability challenges across the West, because that's what we saw in August, and that's what we will see as things heat up. And the Pacific Northwest obviously is part of that. The Bonneville Power has a lot of really low-cost hydro that we buy a lot of. And if that shifts, which it will in some way, we know that, just like our snowpack in the Sierra is becoming more episodic and more difficult to manage. So all of those issues are certainly front and center in terms of our planning, and our long-term forecasts take those trends, those likely trends, into account. And that's so we're planning for that. That doesn't mean that we've got all the answers, because the future is obviously inherently uncertain. But certainly that's front and center in terms of our coordination across the Pacific Coast states and throughout the Western Interconnect. On nuclear, I would say it's pretty cut and dry in California right now that new nuclear is actually prohibited by statute. So in California, we will not get new nuclear until that changes, and I think it's highly unlikely. In a few years, Diablo Canyon, our last operating nuclear power plant, will actually start to be decommissioned, and that will go offline. And so replacement resources for that are also we're closely focused on how to get non-carbon replacement resources, because that's several thousand gigawatts or several thousand megawatts of carbon-free electricity right there. So that'll go offline. So these are all challenges that are on the radar screen for sure, but that does not mean that we have the solutions for all of them. I'm a big proponent, as you probably gathered, of energy efficiency. If the more you can reduce energy consumption and optimize it in terms of its time of use, then the smaller all your other problems are. Then the fewer investments you have to do in even new transmission, but certainly new supply, new traditional supply. And so, and it's cheaper by far than those other resources. And so the better, and it creates more jobs. There's so many benefits of energy efficiency. And it's that tripling of the community colleges that you were discussing before, that rings true with me. We need trades, working class jobs that are skilled labor, that are from the communities we're talking about, so that they can sell into those communities, right? And I think we have an incredibly diverse state. We have dozens and dozens of languages and just huge cultural diversity. And if we can succeed in engaging all those communities and bringing them in so that they can actually do the work, assess the buildings, and get in there and do the work and focus on climate, but also lift up quality of life across the board in doing so, then that's the recipe for success. And I actually think that the converse is a huge danger, right? If we don't do that, then we absolutely are not going to achieve our carbon goals. So we just have to do that. There's no ifs, ands, or buts.
All right. Well, we'll leave it with that recipe for success. Any number of other questions in the chat, but we aren't going to have time to get to those now.
Yeah, Andrew, if you have time to put thoughts in the chat on your answers, that would be great.
Okay, I'll check it out. Thanks
Okay,
everyone
thank
for
you.
your questions. Appreciate it.
So we're going to take a 10-minute break. When we come back from break, if Andrew has sort of provided us this big picture of the California context, he mentioned, and we all know there's kind of two sides of addressing climate change, this imperative. There's the mitigation side, decarbonization, et cetera, and then there's the adaptation and resilience side. And so we're going to come to two provocateurs when we come back that can speak to their work as leaders that have been in the field in California and beyond, addressing those two sides, how things might happen inside California. So with that, let's, Mike, if we can take a 10-minute break. I'm showing 11:29 Central. Is that right? So we'll come back at 11:40 Central in 10 minutes, please. Thank you. So next, what we wanted to do was to get the view of the playing field, if you will, or the field of the future for California from two leaders that have been actively engaged in that work in the state, sort of on the ground. The first that we're going to hear from is John Shin. John has a background really of working climate change and climate change risk throughout his career, principally with major energy companies inside the private sector, but also as an advisor to groups working with the World Bank, the Department of Energy, national labs, et cetera. And, you know, that work really centered on climate risk as well as related greenhouse gas reduction and social responsibility ideas and approaches with regard to the energy environment. And I think, as well, working on the more entrepreneurial startup side of the energy sector with regard to doing that work. So we're pleased to have John with us to talk in particular his experience that may be more centered on the mitigation side, moving toward decarbonization of the energy system, but as well, I think acknowledging a perspective about the other adaptation and resilience perspective. So with that, John, I'll turn it over to you and let you pull up the screen share.
Very good. Thank you, Kyle. Let me pull up my screen here. Okay, first of all, thank you to ECL and thank you all of you for the opportunity to share this exchange. I think this kind of exchange is critical in making progress at all. You'll hear that theme throughout my talk. I think that that exchanging and gathering the right constituents group of people together and to face this challenge is absolutely an essential component of it. So I'm very grateful to be a party to this today. What I'd like to do in my time here is to provoke you a little bit by, you can see in my title, Climate Protection Challenge in the Real World, or meeting that climate protection challenge in the real world. And that's basically what I spent most of my career doing. So I'm going to give you a little bit of feeling for what somebody who's been concerned about this issue for a long time, what we've been doing, the issues that we faced, what kind of general rules have fallen out from those experiences that may be useful for this conversation and the path forward. So that's what we're going to try to do. Let's see what we have to say. All right. So first of all, what I'm going to do in my food for thought in this short time here is to relate to my experience and the beliefs that resulted from that experience, and some observations on how we're going to obtain decarbonization, the kind of programs that Andrew laid out, and what kind of challenges you may run into and how you may be able to face those challenges and overcome them. And also reflect upon some of the things that Bill raised, that and Andrew, that there's a criticality to figuring out how we're going to convene the right groups of people, have them properly trained. And it is, from my point of view, certainly a grand education and engineering challenge, meeting the kind of objectives that you see that Andrew was very assertively put forward for the state. It's going to be interesting to see how we get there, shall we say. But I'm going to try to lay out some of the optimism that I have about what we can do and some thoughts about how we can do better, and how we can mobilize perhaps an engineering education and build the workforce that's going to be necessary to accomplish this. So if that's not enough to cover, let's see what we can talk about here. First of all, I sort of call it 33 years of addressing the climate issue in the energy industry. My background is that I came out of Cal with this great energy feeling like, okay, we're going to change the world now. We're going to get into the energy industry and we're going to get in the inside of it. And we're going to figure out how to make it a better environmentally and better socially. And so I took on an advisory role with Chevron, initially what I call being inside the beast from my point of view of a Cal Berkeley graduate, and getting inside of that mechanism and trying to understand exactly how the mechanism of a large energy company worked, and how to get that large energy company in the world that it lives in, a very capitalistic world, profit-centered world, to focus on something like being more environmentally and socially sound in the way it does its business of delivering the energy that the world needs. So I initially got very much involved as a PhD engineer in new technologies, especially cleaner refining and products technologies. But then when the climate issue came along in the mid-'80s, It was obvious to me that a company that sold carbon needed to really pay attention to something like the climate issue. And so I started building awareness within the company about the importance of the issue, got involved in technology development and capture and storage projects. The world's largest capture project right now is one that came out of that work. And also very much so also in policies, because we weren't going to move forward. The industry wasn't going to move forward unless we had the right kind of approaches, even management incentive plans and things like that to incorporate climate change into the thinking of the company at the management level. And then some very specific activities like flare management, effective corporate strategies, and got involved at the industry level, the oil industry level in their climate management group after the Kyoto Protocol was passed. Got involved in creating public-private partnerships to address the biggest issues of emissions in the oil industry, which is actually flaring management. Those of you who are familiar with what flaring is, where natural gas is burned off at production sites. But then we also got involved in activities that are very much around building an engineering workforce that is adequately trained and understands what the real issues in the world are and has experience in solving them and confidence that they can solve them and motivation to solve them. So got involved in the Engineers Without Borders effort, and then in large efforts within the United States Department of Energy and the national laboratories that develop new technologies to deploy carbon capture technology more rapidly, to optimize the evolution of the power system. The kind of models that Bill was talking about, you need to have those models if you're going to make good decisions and have the right people around the table helping you build those models and use those models to make those decisions for how we're going to change the grid and how we're going to meet, a goal like the electrification of the carbon-free electrification goals for California. You certainly need to have the right modeling tools. You need to have the right people using those modeling tools in order to help you figure out how to do that. And I found myself involved in a lot of advisory boards for national laboratories, major education programs all around climate change. And so that's sort of the way you get your hands on everything within the beast of the energy industry and keep the ball rolling forward. Well, it has been 33 years since I first found myself getting interested in climate change. And so it's with that kind of perspective that I kind of, look at the objectives that are very short term from that point of view of decarbonization for California in the next 10 to 30 years, and have the perspective of seeing what has happened in the last 30 years. And felt like maybe it's a good idea to think about what we've learned in the last 30 years and apply those lessons going forward. So let's try doing that a little bit. Okay, first of all, we live in a capitalistic world, and the economies are still controlled by capitalism as the core way that the economies work. That means that cost is absolutely critical. So no matter what we do, what strategies we take, we need to find low-cost strategies. It's not just about meeting the profit motive of the private sector, but it's also about that it creates the least resistance in the public. If the price of power starts skyrocketing as a result of becoming carbon-free, you can expect a whole lot of resistance from the public around the actions that are being taken, and therefore the policies will be weakened. On the other hand, if you can apply low-cost strategies, it allows deeper reduction sooner because there's less resistance from the public and less cost impact on the private sector. So cost is almost the number one thing, not surprisingly from somebody who's been living in the private sector and trying to address climate change. But I think it carries over whether in your private sector or whatever sector you're in. Bridging strategies are essential. My little bridge picture here, one of the key things that I learned in the lessons that we had is that you really needed to go from where you are to where you want to get to. You cannot underestimate the inertia of the system you already have. Take the inertia of the grid. We have to keep the grid operating to provide electricity all the time. And as you put more and more renewables onto the grid, you have to find a way to modify that grid in a way that it can accept the renewables without creating crashes in supply. So yes, many people are thinking about this, but that's just one example of the inertia. The inertia in the transportation system is substantial. Trying to build enough charging stations for electric vehicles you're trying to put into the transportation system. There's just so many examples of what the existing system is doing. And so you really want to look at what you have and where you want to be and consciously try to bridge between those two in the way that is the least cost pathway. And you need to be agile because things change. Priorities change and various issues come up. The other issues that we're looking at earlier today will also impact your choices on how you're going to address climate change. It's inevitable. And so you have to be very agile. There's a common thing in global issues that say, think global, act local. Well, I think in a climate issue, it's really very important to understand that you need to think global and local and act global and local. It's wonderful to hear what California is planning to do for climate. And Andrew, I am so impressed with the programs being developed within California. It's all necessary. We need to do the things we need to do in California. We need to demonstrate what the world can do. But we also very much need to think about what California's role is in the rest of the world and how California can not only promote action within California, but promote action around the rest of the world. All the countries in the world need to be involved if we're going to address the global climate issue, especially the bigger developing countries, China and India. These places, we need to create incentives and we need to demonstrate ways that they can address climate change and give them the economic incentives to do so. I've become a big proponent of cap and trade and those kind of things in the early days for that very reason, because those kind of economic incentives do drive action in those that are unwilling to take policy actions within their own countries because their priorities around economic development or social well-being. Okay, need to bring the forces together. I think we've heard this theme quite a bit already. Public-private partnerships, just bringing the right groups of people together with the right expertise is a very multidisciplinary problem. If we don't bring the right economic, political, environmental, technology development, social forces, synergizing, working together, working with the kind of systems that Bill was putting up, having the models available to them to test their assumptions, to challenge one another as to what the right path is, and to together collaborate in a way that makes progress. For years and years, the oil industry flared off natural gas in remote production operations, and that was rising every decade for over the course of several decades. And the reason nothing was really happening is that the private sector was saying, well, we really can't afford to do anything else. And the public sector was saying you have to do something else, but unwilling to lose the profits that they gained from the production themselves. So it took getting the public and private sector together to address the issue. And when we did that, we started making progress on the issue. So I was involved in a collaboration with the World Bank to create that kind of public-private partnership. We need many more of these public-private partnerships in every area that we're going to be addressing climate change. And that brings really naturally to the next issue, which is that all strategies and approaches are needed. I really love the chart that Andrew put up with the multicolored boxes and all the different approaches that California is taking in order to approach the issue, because we need every single one of them. The problem is just way too big for any single approach to work. So you can't think about just decarbonizing the grid or decarbonizing transportation. You've got to do it all. You've got to think about buildings. You've got to think about every possible approach, and therefore train people and involve people that are involved in every possible approach. It's also true that if you're going to learn how to do things well in any of these various approaches, you really need to study and find out where you can do things, apply these different approaches, and which ones are going to be most effective in what places first. That relates to cost. Because if you look at any particular technology approach for addressing climate change, there's wide variations in cost depending on where you can apply them. So for instance, when we were applying flaring reduction, we were looking for the places where we could make the most profitable gas sales from utilizing the gas, and then develop the the commercial viable plans for building and operating large-scale gas deployment facilities. And we looked for the places where that could best work first, and proved out our concepts there, and then moved to more expensive places when we had more proven concepts. So all the strategies are needed, and you want to be able to find the places we can do them best first. Unintended consequences. I kind of like this cartoon, the guy leaning on the dominoes, and it's coming around, and of course the other dominoes on the other side about to whack him. There are a lot of complex interactions of climate protection, the environment, economy, security, water, human well-being. I've heard many solutions to climate change that just, frankly, in my opinion, completely ignore the social impact of what they're doing. For instance, we can't afford to make the cost of energy go so high that we slow development in the developing world. That would be, from my point of view, an unconscionable thing to do. We can't make the energy costs so high that we can't afford to clean or reprocess water. We've got to find a way to address climate change in a manner that we don't create these unintended negative results on human development and human well-being or the environment well-being by what we've done.
John, we've got about 5 more minutes.
Very good. Wrapping it up. Enlightened capitalism. This has really been a core theme of what I think we need to do very much, and what I've been trying to do in getting inside the beast during my career, as it were. The key to me is, in the world we live in, is to find ways to make the activities that we want to have happen, activities that support for-profit motives. We need to have a new generation of innovators and entrepreneurs. I'm very happy to hear Andrew referring to how they're catalyzing entrepreneurial work within California, but we need this on a very global scale. We need to have new businesses that are starting up. It's a tough thing to do, but there are ways to do it. We need to have policies that help entrepreneurs succeed. So we certainly need to look at how we use the capitalistic beast, that profit motive, to make us successful in our endeavors. But finally, this brings us to what I think is really the core, and I think the core that this discussion we're having today needs to address, and that is we need to have to figure out how to educate a new workforce at all levels. And Bill was mentioning you find that you have to start at the middle school level to get people the right kind of skills that will make them capable of contributing at higher levels. I think it's even earlier that we need to get our children thinking about these things as part of our grade school education. And we need to use all the levels of training that we have available to us to build all kinds of people that are capable of contributing to this issue in many different ways. And they're not all engineers. They're technicians, but they're also skilled in other areas. These people need to be able to talk to one another. They need to be able to collaborate. They need to have real world experience. One of the things I really appreciate about Engineers Without Borders is that they created, as part of engineering education, the opportunity for students to get real world experience going out and changing the world in a positive manner. We need to give those positive experiences part of our education program and build a whole army of educated people ready to jump into the climate issue and contribute to it. Well, thank you for the opportunity to contribute my thoughts to this. I hope these add to the conversation. I'm certainly willing to contribute in any further ways that I can.
Great. Thank you, John. And certainly we'll take advantage of your participation in the upcoming exercises as well. So I want to turn next to our second provocateur in this segment, and that's Heather Rock. And Heather is the climate resilience chief for Pacific Gas and Electric PG&E here in Northern California. She comes, at that work from a background in public policy and international affairs, and has been involved in looking at climate change and the resilience and adaptation side of climate change, and with that particular focus in terms of her work with PG&E. And you know, what we want to do is, you know, have her talk about, you know, what is PG&E, you know, how are they beginning to, or not beginning to, how are they continuing to address this from their perspective? So with that, Heather, I'll let you take it and pull up your slides.
Great.
Thank you.
A second. Let's see. A little bit of a delay on Zoom. It's kind of odd. It is not. Maybe I'll just share my screen and do it that way. For some reason it is. Okay. All right, so you can probably see my screen, and now I'll switch to presentation mode. All right, can everyone see this and hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Fantastic. All right, well, again, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm Heather Rock, the PG&E's Director of Climate Resilience, and we are going to talk about sort of, you know, essentially climate resilience and adaptation. And, you know, we've heard from a number of presenters talking about that broad context of what is happening globally and in California with climate change. Some interesting, I have some comments to make about, you know, focusing on costs at the end, and how that's sort of translated into the costs that we are now facing with how to actually deal with the fact that we've had over 100 years of historical greenhouse gas emissions baked into our system. So I'll talk about the need for climate resilience. I will get into PG&E's playbook of how we want to use forward-looking climate data into our decision-making. I'll give two examples, one about our vulnerability assessment that we're conducting, and then something that I hope the engineers on this call will like. We'll get into a new decision-making framework looking at how do we update design standards to address future climate change. So a quick overview of what PG&E is. PG&E is California's, and I think one of the nation's largest combined electric and gas utility. You can see in the map here, our service area covers most of California, going from just north of LA up through almost to the border with Oregon. We serve about 16 million Californians, and you can see on the slide that we have a lot of infrastructure. In terms of generation capacity, miles of pipelines, miles of electric grid lines. So we have a pretty big number of assets and people and just territory that we're talking about. So why do we care about adaptation, and why is it as important as mitigation? Well, if you look at the emissions trends from, you know, the last 100 years or so, and we look at the expectations for you know, the future of greenhouse gas emissions with the Paris Climate Agreement and the different commitments that have been made in the US and abroad, we see that we are probably on a business as usual greenhouse gas emissions trajectory, which has real implications for the future of our planet, frankly. And we already see that our historical emissions are having a real impact in terms of today's temperatures. And I think, you know, everyone probably on this call has either experienced some sort of climate-induced natural hazard or has certainly read in the paper about them, right? And if we just look at what happened last year, you know, last year was among the 3 hottest years in recorded history. We had, as Andrew mentioned, we had record-breaking wildfires in California. We had, I think, one of the largest number of hurricanes in the U.S. And of course, some of the hottest temperatures that we've ever recorded. But I think the hottest temperature ever recorded in Death Valley last August. And the unfortunate issue is that even if we were to stop all emissions today, we already have, because of this historical record, a lot of you know, global warming essentially baked in terms of climate impacts already baked into our system. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that really means. You know, a few months ago, I was attending a presentation of some of my counterparts from other utilities, and I loved this quote that one of them brought by Buckminster Fuller. And I think this really applies to how we have to think about designing and operating and maintaining all of our critical infrastructure across the globe. And especially when we think about, the history of our infrastructure and what was it built for? And essentially it was built for an environment that no longer exists. And when we think about what happened to Texas a month or two ago, think about California's experience over the last few years. What's really important is we change our mindset, and we have to no longer think of these extreme weather conditions as unprecedented anymore. We have to expect them. And with changing that way that we think, we also have to acknowledge that the models of the past, largely weather patterns, patterns of the way that our society uses energy or other critical infrastructure, are just not reflective of the future. And what I often talk about internally with our teams is that we have to learn to use different types of data into our decision making. So when we think about what something like climate resilience looks like for PG&E, for us, and I imagine that many of you could probably relate this to the places that you work, is that you think about your own companies or your organization's mission and vision and goals, right? And for PG&E, it's to safely, reliably, and affordably and ever cleanly provide energy to our customers. With climate change, we recognize that we have to continue that core mission even as the environment in which we operate is changing around us. So that might mean that, in Fresno, which is in the interior of California, which is projected to see an increase in the severity and frequency of heat waves, we have to be able to provide that safe, reliable, and affordable service if there's going to be 10 5-day heat waves in that area each year. Or if we think about what might happen in the Sacramento Delta or sea level rise in the San Francisco Bay, we have to continue to be able to provide service if there's major flooding events. And of course, we're all very familiar with the challenge of wildfire in California and everything that PG&E has had to do to catch up to this very serious climate risk. And our goal is that we need to plan for and adapt to all of these climate-induced hazards before they happen, before our environment changes. So how do we actually do that? So we have a playbook that we've developed over the last couple of years, thinking about how do we use forward-looking climate risk data and how do we actually integrate that data into our decision-making. And I'm going to focus just internally today. We also do a lot of work externally with local governments and communities, but I imagine many of you are interested in how do we use this data, how do you use this data in your organization. So I'm going to focus really on our internal efforts today. And it really boils down for us into about 5 big buckets. The first is that we're conducting a system-wide climate vulnerability assessment, and I'm going to get into a little bit of what that looks like. But that's really just understanding what the nature of the problem, how sensitive we are to this problem, and starting to think about what we're going to do about it. We also are working a lot with our design standards engineers and folks who are experts in all the different pieces of equipment that are necessary to run our system, to think about how we design our equipment so they're not only safe and reliable for today, but they will be safe and reliable and across their entire asset life, acknowledging that if you have a piece of equipment that's going to have a 50-year asset life, in 50 years, the conditions that asset is operating in are going to be very different than they are today. We're also working to integrate forward-looking climate data and information into our risk models, both at the enterprise level and at the asset level. And then we're using that data into our asset management plans. So a lot of our teams have very detailed plans where they're thinking about the conditions of assets both now into the future, and then essentially prioritizing when does something get upgraded or replaced. And we want to make sure that we're thinking about those future conditions and using that climate data to inform that. And of course, our projects, when we're putting something in the ground or we're upgrading something, we want our project managers to be thinking about climate risk the same way they might be thinking about the impact to a community or the impact on the environment. And you can see in the yellow box to the left that this materializes in a number of different types of decisions that we could make. How and where we harden our system, where we might install a microgrid. We're thinking about physical or green infrastructure like a seawall. These are the types of decisions that we're making. And the outcome of this is really focused on our customers, our communities, and our shareholders, thinking that We want a safe and reliable system. We want an affordable system. And I think what really resonates for a lot of us is thinking that if we can do this well, and we don't have to spend extra money when something fails before it was supposed to because we didn't think about those future conditions, that translates into lower customer bills, right? And that translates into higher shareholder returns. So there's a real thought in terms of thinking about how do we get those outcomes, both in terms of increased resilience, but also keeping our energy costs low. So I'll dig into a couple examples. I'll first talk about our climate vulnerability assessment and sort of our process through that. So the scope of our vulnerability assessment is we're looking at all of our infrastructure, our operations and services, and the methodology is here in the green circles. So we're updating our knowledge of climate risk using data from the California Fourth Climate Assessment. Then we have discussions with our asset design standards engineers and experts about sensitivity, sort of like that so what question of, if it's going to flood here, does it actually matter for this piece of equipment? If it gets really hot here, how will that piece of equipment perform? And then we also have discussions about adaptive capacity. So that's asking how hard is it, or is it relatively easy to change something? I think a good example to think about this is that it's probably easier to, upsize a transformer so that it can take more load than it is to move an entire electric substation. The outcome of this is that in a few years, we're going to be issuing a vulnerability assessment. This is something that we're going to be delivering to the California Public Utilities Commission, but also informing a lot of our stakeholders and local governments and communities that are interested in this as well. And eventually, we're going to be going to our Public Utilities Commission and saying, here's all the adaptation projects that we think are needed in order to make our system more resilient. So I'll dig into a little bit of what this actually looks like beyond the scope. So, at a very high level, what we did is we started with our service territory and said, okay, let's look at, this is an example of 2050. What is the future of climate change in California going to look like? And you can see here, the future of precipitation in terms of, what are the maximums that we might see over 5 days in 2050 across our service territory? Or if we're looking at heat, what are the 7 hottest days going to look like in 2050 in our service territory? These kind of questions are interesting for us because we want to think about, are there certain thresholds that we might now experience with climate change where our system is not going to be able to perform reliably if under these sorts of conditions? Other things that we're interested in are looking at things like the future of flooding. With changes in precipitation and snowpack in California is going to result in a lot of changes to the way that we manage our water systems. And we have a lot of hydro assets. So this is something we deeply care about. And of course, wildfire. This is, using data from California's Fourth Climate Assessment, we can see that within our service territory alone, it is possible that under a business as usual greenhouse gas scenario that we could see an increase of 43% of the amount of acreage that's burned on average in any given year in our service territory. And you can see the more extreme parts of our service territory are, in terms of change, are highlighted here in red. So then we think about, how does this translate into sensitivity? What matters actually for our assets? And here are a couple examples looking at things like our electric substations. We have discussions with folks that designed the system of what we have today. And we look at, okay, well, if we know that, historically our electric substations were designed to one threshold in a coastal district and a different threshold in the interior, and then we overlay that with information about the future heat conditions, for example, we can start to pinpoint areas where, okay, we now have a number of substations that are colored red in this graphic that might actually will probably be subject to temperatures outside the range that they were designed to operate in. So that kind of data can then translate into our design standards work and our asset management work to say, okay, how do we want to then think about prioritizing investments to potentially upgrade those substations? The same question with flooding risk in the future here, shown in the middle graphic. If we look at the projections for sea level rise in the San Francisco Bay, we can see, as shown by the colored dots, that we have a number of substations that are at risk of flooding from sea level rise. And if we drill down even more, we can start getting very local and thinking about, okay, well, let's look at this one particularly vulnerable substation. And this is a map of our Ravenswood transmission level substation in the southern part of the San Francisco Bay. And we can see that if we look at future sea level rise scenario and we add on a 100-year storm scenario, we can see that we have some real problems. Here on the right is an actual picture of that substation during a king tide event. These are really interesting times to look at what the projections of sea level rise might be in the future, looking at an extreme tide of today. And this is the back of our Ravenswood substation. So clearly, when you tack on sea level rise to this and then maybe a storm event, you can see just how vulnerable a lot of this equipment is to flooding. So I'll segue into a second example, and that is just how do we think about design standards for the future? This is a graphic that I took from Con Edison, which is the electric utility of New York, which has done some great thinking in terms of how do we think about our existing asset base, and then how are we going to change it over time? And what you can see from the, this yellowish, I guess, triangle, or it was a triangle before it was cut, you have your asset base that is built to existing or historical standards. And over time, you start to say, okay, I'm going to start upgrading elements of this asset base so that more and more of it becomes blue, and you know that it's designed for those future conditions. And recognizing that there will probably always be some segment of your asset base that's probably not designed for the future. So we need to have some sort of emergency preparedness and response measures in case something materializes that we haven't prepared for. And I think this is my last slide in case we're worried about time, but getting to that question of, okay, well, what do we do with that existing asset base, and how do we think about those design standards for the future? This creates all sorts of complicated questions of, well, what do I believe the future to be? What do I think the trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions might be? And then how do I select that and then make decisions on what the global temperatures and climate hazards will be? We plan to what's called RCP 8.5, which is more or less that business as usual greenhouse gas scenario. And we choose that not because we believe necessarily that that is what is going to happen, but because we are operating really critical infrastructure that's a lifeline for the community, we want to be as conservative as possible. The second question is, well, what's relevant from my project or my asset? And that's where you need to have a discussion with the folks that are experts on your project or the certain assets of what actually matters. And that kind of goes back to our vulnerability assessment. And then finally, you have to have discussions about things like risk tolerance. I think what's most challenging about this line of work is that there's a whole range of probabilities and potential scenarios that we all might be experiencing. And depending on your risk tolerance, you might say, well, I want to plan for my Ravenswood substation, which serves hundreds of thousands of customers. I want to be very, very risk averse in this scenario, and so I'll choose a much more conservative scenario that says, okay, I'll have more sea level rise than I would if, and associated costs with building to that sea level rise than I would if I was less risk tolerant. So I think my time is up, so I will leave it at that, and I will be happy to take any questions. Thank you all for your time today.
Thank you, Heather. So what I want to do is open it up for, we've got a short period of time for questions for either Heather or for John. Going back to those, we've got a question in the chat from Pat Natali. Heather, has PG&E discussed the Energy Strong plan that PSE&G implemented in response to Superstorm Sandy? Their plan was designed to address future climate change challenges.
I haven't heard of that one. I'll check it out. We've worked a lot with Con Edison, but I'll make a note. Thank you.
Okay. And Clint Robinson, how does, this is a great example of engineering adaptation for utility. How does your risk window change when California is carbon free in 2045, or does it change at all?
I think that's a really good question. One of the things we are thinking about is how, when we think about that grid of the future and all the decisions that we need to make for that future, we're not only thinking about changes in today's climate risk and future climate risk, but also that policy environment. So how do we need to think about the changes in the type of electricity that we're going to be relying on, or changes in demographic trends. And I think maybe what you're also getting at is even, and I think this goes back to what John said, even if California does all its part to become a carbon neutral state, the rest of the world also has a trajectory of emissions and policies as well. So we have to probably acknowledge that our risk is going to continue to increase even as we're doing the right thing here in California.
All right, thank you. Any other questions at this point?
Kyle, this is Mike. I've got a question for John. John, after your 32 years in the beast, as you described, how would you characterize the view of climate change within the beast?
Well, I think there's been a recognition that's evolved over time. I think certainly the beast wanted to go on doing what it was doing at the very beginning, no doubt about it, and even resisted believing in the issue being something that was real. But that has changed over time considerably, and I think that the strategy that really helped that change happen is what I call the risk management point of view. That even if you don't believe, or even if you believe that there are other possibilities besides the climate responding to emissions the way we pretty much most of the world expects it would, you really can't run a business without managing the risk that it's not going to do what you hope it will do. In other words, believing that climate's not an issue for the industry is just not a good risk management strategy. And that's helped people evolve their thinking to the point where they really deal with their emissions and you deal with their planning and everything else about what they're doing effectively.
Heather, when in John's presentation, he talked about the inertia factor that we're going to face in terms of making the changes that are necessary dealing with climate. In your chart where you were showing, the changeover from the existing equipment and assets to the new, does that factor of inertia sort of play into your thinking about it, or a perspective about how do you deal with that inertia inside that large system that you're a caretaker for?
Yeah, and if I might be a little provocative here. So I worked at Chevron for 5 years on climate policy before coming to PG&E. So I also had a view of working inside the beast and then made the shift to a utility. And I think it's just really a different way of thinking about things, right? From an oil and gas, you're predominantly market-based, right? You're very interested in I think preserving the status quo, if I might say that. And coming to PG&E, there's much more of a customer focus in terms of, we're providing a critical service for people. And I think our experience in the last few years, particularly with a Camp Fire, really was a huge wake-up call for us. And so while there might have been an inertia and an unwillingness to change things in the past, I think with the Camp Fire behind us, with other extreme weather events that are happening across the country, I think there's a real sense of urgency that might not have been there a few years ago. And I think the utilities, with the sheer amount of critical and vulnerable infrastructure across the country, I think everyone is having their wake-up call. I think Con Edison probably had it with Superstorm Sandy. We had it with the Camp Fire. I bet there are a lot of Texas utilities that are having their wake-up call right now, right? And so I think that sense of inertia is changing, because we're recognizing that particularly for critical infrastructure, not doing anything is no longer okay.
Right.
If I may, I'd like to comment on this too, Kyle.
Sure.
Yeah, Heather, very, very well said. But you also have the problem of having the actual on the ground facilities, and that you've got to go from where you are now in terms of the carbon intensity of your on the ground facilities and your power delivery to a model that's matching the kind of objectives that Andrew is putting in front of you. And that's a lot of change. And, especially things around, what technologies you're going to choose, where you're going to apply them, how you're going to keep constant provision of the service for your customers while you're doing all that and still control cost. There's a lot of really difficult things to overcome in terms of the stability of the grid and assessing your technology choices, making optimum decisions. How are you doing that?
All right. Thanks.
Yeah. And
okay.
Go ahead,
a
Kyle.
short response, Heather, and then I'm gonna move on.
I think when the right incentives are there and when industries really want to shift, they do. If we think about, maybe 15 years ago, fracking was really not a technology that anybody used, and people were talking about peak oil, right? And once we had a technological change, we can see just how swiftly and with such, seriousness, that entire industry shifted. And I think we could apply the same thing to climate change, right? If people really wanted to change, they would. But because you have the dynamics of the structures and the market dynamics of today, I think the inertia isn't because the technology isn't there. The inertia is there is because companies like their market share and they like the status quo. And if they wanted to change, they could.
All right, thanks. Well, certainly we've got, if you look at the path or the journey ahead for California in terms of addressing climate change and accomplishing the goals that Andrew has articulated, that California has, changes in the offing, lots of change, deep change as well as, decarbonization. So what we want to do is we're going to take a short break, our lunch or brunch break, depending on whether you're on the East Coast or the West Coast. And give people a short period of time for that, a little bit longer than our last break. And then when we come back to that, we want to shift away from, hearing from our provocateurs to really trying to leverage the group genius that's present on our Zoom call today and put you into an extended exercise where we're going to ask you to explore how that change may happen inside California. And it will be the equivalent of what you could characterize a backcasting exercise from the strategic planning view, assuming that, if we were 30 years from now, sitting in 2050, assuming that California had in fact been successful meeting those ambitious goals that it had set for itself, what did it do right would be a first question, and we'll explore that. But then that just puts in place a scenario of the future that will ask you to then look at and say, well, what role did the engineering community play? What was critical about, the things that the engineering community did, or how it was, in order to allow California to actually have done that? What role, what responsibilities did the engineering community take in order to accomplish that? And how was the engineering community transformed? So we're going to move into a small group exercises to explore that territory when we come back from our break. So what I want to do is set up this exercise that we want to move to. And if you went in, if you glanced over at your Google workbook, the Google Doc workbook, the exercise begins, there's just a placemaker for it that I'm going to refer to. We might have changed page numbers. So I'm going to do a screen share here and give you the instructions for the exercise, and we'll move off there just a second. So the basic exercise, what we're going to try and do is to get you to do two things. One, use your imagination about how California can proceed to reach the ambitious goals that have been set up with regard to its policy timeline. And on page, what's now page 17 in the book, just a reminder of what the basic goals for California are. By 2030, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 40% below the 1990 levels, and that 60% of the electric grid is serviced by renewable energy. Then by 2045, moving another 15 years out, that the state will have attained carbon neutrality by sequestering all remaining emissions, and that 100% of retail electricity sold in California will be with renewable and zero carbon resources. And then finally, by 2050, the state would have reduced greenhouse emissions from all sectors to 80% or more below the 1990 levels, with again all remaining emissions sequestered. Now that was the energy side of the picture, the deep decarbonization that needs to take place. But California also is very aware and committed toward to dealing with the adaptation and resilience piece. Though, you know, recognizing a whole series of the points that Heather was helping illustrate, that from an adaptation and resilience, there's the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resilience Program run by the state. And that program, we've given you one of their documents as a resource to review coming into this session, would be to also address the state's vulnerability to climate change while also equitably transitioning to a carbon neutral economy. So there's this piece of, you know, addressing the vulnerabilities, you know, from an adaptation standpoint, but also addressing that equitable question with regard to social and environmental justice as we go about doing that program. So, you know, it's not enough just to do the energy side of things. We need to do it in a way that leaves the state in a healthier, more resilient, and equitable position at the end of that 30-year process that the state is entering into. So that's the goals that the state has put forward. Your job in your small groups, and I'll illustrate it just by looking at the exercise instructions for one of the groups, is first, what, you know, when you get into your small groups, there'll probably be about, you know, 7 or 8 of you in each of the groups. If you would designate one person as discussion leader, a person as the recorder working in the Google Doc, and then somebody that'll be prepared to present out, as well as make your introductions in terms of who's who inside your group, then we'd like you to take roughly half of the time that we're going to give you in small groups and do the imagining of the future piece. And so the point there, or the question is, imagine a future where California has achieved its climate change goals for both decarbonization and adaptation and resilience along that policy guideline. And then you're going to be asked to work backwards from 2050 to now and, you know, try and identify what key developments or steps along that path took place that allowed California to achieve it. What were the big things that California did right? And, you know, what were some of those major achievements? Now here, what we'd like you to do is not try and focus on the technological breakthroughs, but rather think about some of the other process or collaborations or other things that happened or that happened that allowed California to achieve its goals at the end of that period of time. So we'd like you to work that development of that scenario, imagining what that, what California did over the next 30 years that allowed the state to achieve that. Now, as you're doing that in your small groups, don't fall into debating substantively for long periods of time the things that people are imagining. Just open it up more like a brainstorming exercise, accept what people are suggesting in order to construct this future scenario, and working relatively quickly. So you'll have about 25 minutes to work that step. Once that's put together, we want you to switch to a process by then using your scenario. Imagine what is it that the engineers and the engineering community did that contributed to achieving the events or the key things that happened in your scenario. What were some of the engineering community's major contributions? What were success factors for the engineers and for the engineering community? What skills, attributes, capacities might have been most important? And as you know, what came of age in that 30-year timeline in terms of potential transformations that happened to the engineering community. And so that'll be about 25 minutes. So we're going to give you roughly 55 minutes in your small groups. We'd like you to split your time, and if you move through the first step a little bit faster, that's great. The heart of this exercise from our perspective is the part 2, in terms of that reflection and inquiry, but we need to have the substance of part one for you to reflect on. So that's the exercise going forward. We're going to put you into, I believe, 10 small groups. There are pages, 2 pages each for each one of the groups. So again, advance forward in the Google Doc till you find your group or the number corresponding to the group that you've been assigned. Assign your roles and then get started. With that, Mike, do you want to move people into the breakout groups, please? All right, well, thanks everyone in terms of moving back to the whole group here. And what I'd like to do is focus this report in terms of go to each one of the groups and we'll have a minute or two, but only a minute or two. So the need to be fairly concise. What I'd like you to do is pick out, have your presenter pick out 1 or 2 items that showed up in the part 2, reflection and inquiry about, you know, thinking about the engineering community or engineers, you know, what role did they play? How did they contribute to success? What, you know, how did they change? How did the younger generation contribute? Just pick 1 or 2 things on your list from that part 2 reflection that you would like to share with the whole group. We'll have the benefit and we'll be able to look back at all the notes that you've taken in the Google book. But we'd be interested in what would you particularly highlight. We recognize we're really, you know, allowing your presenter to pick and choose here, but we'll trust them to represent your group well. So with that, I want to start with group 1. You know, who was the presenter on group 1, and what was 1 or 2 of those key insights? Just a minute or 2 in terms of time.
All right, thanks, Kyle. Mike Stats for group 1 here. What I would hit on here is back in Houston, we talked a little bit about how the architectural group came up with a policy on sustainability practices, and you know how can the engineering industry do something similar to that, so that we can really become that voice for not only the scientists and the data and the owners and the policymakers, that they really look to us for more guidance in some of those areas there. We also talked about just some of the key items here is just how we communicate and how we stay involved, and we're part of that group that is communicating there. It was kind of talked about there, you know, having that Fauci person that is, you know, is an engineer that's so widely respected across the nation, that they really listen to, that when there's an issue, they go to the person that's like this, and they listen and hear things. But we need to be involved in a lot of these upfront items there, and be in that level that the White House and governors and other folks from states are really listening to us.
All right, so to be Fauci from that perspective, and you know, be you know, at the level that it makes a difference in terms of that policy level, at whichever level the system that you're working. Great, and that commitment to that higher purpose. We'll come to that in just a moment. Group 2. Thanks, Mike. That was well done.
Joe Barbagallo for group 2. So we spent a lot of time discussing the roles that the engineering community can play in education, educating the public, supporting on development of curricula to train engineers in new skills, and also to support the retraining of those maybe coming out of the carbon industry. So there was a big element on training and education. I would say that one of the main, and I think this is probably the big umbrella that encompasses a lot, is to just take some ownership and lead. You know, get away from that inclination to work behind the scenes, be willing to get out front in public forums, invest, as if you're a company, invest our time and money in innovation and supporting legislative change. You know, also, you know, help develop that vision for the engineering community to help see this through, that big vision that when a hurdle is hit, I mean, when a barrier is hit, that it pushes the community through that hurdle on. It was connected to, and was just discussed about coming up with a way to best evaluate policies and solutions to help create that common language and that common understanding relative towards how to, you know, accomplishing that broader vision.
Great. All right, thank you, Joe. Group 3.
Hi, everybody. Stephanie Hamilton for Group 3. We actually talked about a lot of the same things that have been mentioned, which I just think is really cool that there was that kind of consistency, talking about the importance of the engineering community giving voice to some of these things, and the urgency of the issue, and also the not just being the voice of doom and gloom, but also the voice of possible solutions and innovations and things like that. We talked about the importance of engineers being willing to go first when it comes to exploring innovations and new developments in either processes or material use and things like that. Those are the main kind of common threads through ours, and then also engineers. One of the things we talked about was engineers thinking globally but acting locally, and just acknowledging that when you talk about climate change, it's not just it's a global issue that only gets addressed if everybody's addressing it kind of in their local communities.
Great. All right. Thank you, Stephanie. All right. Group number 4.
All right. This is Ken Fuller. I think you can hear me. So group 4, what we similarly to what's gone before us, so taking a little bit beyond that, we said start early and really start to educate future engineers early and our public early, really pulling the best and brightest back into engineering, reward creativity beyond just what their product sales, but really be rewarding innovation, which talks about failures are part of success. So problem solving, learning, being system thinking, being heard, help to educate the politics, important, the private, as well as the public on what our goals and responsibilities are. And one phrase that one of our members came out with was focus on the futurity of decisions. So life cycle costs beyond just dollars, but there was an example of healthcare, how corporately healthcare has changed with systems, but be really into that system thinking mode.
Great. Thank you, Ken. All right. Group 5.
Hey, Kyle. So our group really focused on the engineers and their education of the public in our discussion. And it really came down to, I guess I summed it up in the last minute. And I think we all agreed that, the net zero or the zero carbon goal is really no more than a marketing solution, and engineers need to hit the technical aspects just as hard as they ever had, but the technical solutions and policy design isn't really worth anything if you can't sell it to the public. And the engineer needs to be integrated at all levels of design, and you got to include all the stakeholders so no one gets left out, to provide equitable solutions. So bottom line, we decided that education was the engineer's most important role in all of this, and to further push out that education, we need to go back into the curriculum of engineers and include the experience. You need success experience in school. You need to be a contributor. You need to learn from doing. And you've got to be able to interact with all the different stakeholders in any given project.
Great. All right. Thank you, Josh. Group 6.
Hey, Sam here for Group 6. Just in general, kind of a big conclusion of kind of how we ended our meeting was kind of the blending of engineering and science. As engineers, we're going to have to become more of the scientific mind on this. We're going to have to create the new ideas. We're also going to have to potentially kind of narrow down our specialties. I mean, you think of civil engineer, there's kind of a broad realm of what a civil engineer does. So is it more looking at new entry-level engineers specializing and how we combine those if it's not under one roof? Is it more thinking like how the technical world thinks, and we're kind of drawing from different countries, different states, different engineering companies to get the exact technical aspect that we need?
Let me ask you, Sam, as you say that, in our last summit, which was on licensure, one of the ideas that was expressed, and we were hearing from a person running a program at Texas A&M, but we talked about, shifting from thinking about the traditional, disciplines of engineering, mechanical, civil, et cetera, to a new multidisciplinary stance. And the example we were using there was mobility engineering, which requires a whole bunch of different technical disciplines from an engineer, but you need that master discipline in order to put it together. Is there a similar, in your thinking, were you thinking about, sort of, is there a similar master discipline or a new integrated discipline around, I don't know, whether it be energy or around decarbonization or something like that?
I think in general, yeah, kind of a more, I wouldn't necessarily call it a master discipline, but I think it's more of kind of a focus. Like,
okay.
You have your mechanical engineers, they focus on mechanical. You have your structural engineers, they focus on structural. I think it's creating those more focused disciplinary aspects to kind of specialize in these things that need to be developed.
Okay.
Potentially.
Thanks, Sam. Group 7.
Sorry, got to get myself off mute. Britt Smith with Group 7. A lot of things that we talked about have already been mentioned, but to try to summarize those, we were looking at it from the standpoint of focusing on life cycle costs, driving innovation through partnerships and multidiscipline communication, but really getting engineers that can communicate across disciplines, across socioeconomic boundaries, across racial boundaries, to be an inclusive, develop an entirely conclusive solution, and be socially conscious of what those decisions mean as they drive forward. With a by using performance-based specs, you can increase innovation and allow for creativity, as opposed to just simply you will use this part to do this job.
All right, thank you, Britt. Group 8.
Mike Uppington with Group 8. A lot of what we discussed has already been discussed as well. We kind of had two main points of emphasis. One being making sure that engineers get that more active voice, both with regards to policy and decision making, using their skill sets to help educate, so that those policies, those decisions are made in the correct manner. And then second focus is on actually providing additional education to our engineers and focusing on broadening their perspective, making sure that they have that overall social and policy mindset, and ultimately allow them to develop some of those novel ideas, those novel technologies, bring those recommendations to their clients, whoever they're working for, so they can drive these ideas forward.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Group 9.
Yeah, this is Paul Versa from Group 9. We indicated engineers to take the lead role in defining the importance of solving this grand challenge. And what we're saying is engineers have to be able to articulate to the general public and different types of the public why we need to do what we're looking to do and how important it is, and get it to relate to the individuals themselves. Politicians have a different point of view. Doctors have a different point of view. Financial people have another point of view. People who are economically deprived have another point of view, and we've got to kind of work on coalescing all this to, so each and every one of them can understand, probably in a different way, why it's important for them to do this and to get focus on the goal at hand. Because if we don't have a very singular focus on where we want to go as a world, it's going to be a tough time. And we think the engineers are up to that challenge and can do it, but we've all got to learn how to do that kind of thing as well and get better at it.
All right. Thanks, Paul. And finally, group 10.
Yeah, we believe that engineers contributed to climate change by designing systems that are economical, reliable, and sustainable, and provided a lot of innovation, particularly for new and combined technologies. For example, the combination of batteries with nuclear reactors. And by the way, in the first part, we identified that California was going to have to change their laws and policies to accept nuclear power as a reliable baseload. In other words, they can't achieve their goals without something like small modular reactors. We also believe that engineers have adopted a standard of care that includes climate change and climate data, and have developed innovative energy storage technologies. For example, rather than batteries, you could store hydrogen that's generated from nuclear plants during low demand periods. And engineers contributed innovation that reduces the costs of the technologies that can transform carbon emissions. One of the things is green concrete. Concrete consumes a lot of energy, as you know, and has a lot of contribution to global warming, and green concrete can solve a lot of that. And one of the key success factors for engineers was the formation of multidisciplinary teams. In other words, that includes not only multiple engineering disciplines, but disciplines beyond engineering in solving these problems. You've got to blend the boundaries between disciplines and break down walls in education and training. And the thing that we believe that engineers were able to contribute most positively was their innovation and passion. The new generation that's coming along is going to have new ideas, going to have great imagination, and we believe that we can leverage the full population of engineers, including women and minorities. So the new multidisciplinary approach to solving problems is going to be important. The ability to use big data tools and new technology, including technologists and scientists, in addition to traditional engineers. And we believe that the people coming along, the new people, are going to not be locked into the thinking of the past. In other words, they're going to start with a clean sheet of paper with passion and imagination. Right. And they're going to use climate modeling. And we also believe that the engineers are going to bring more credibility to the engineering community as problem solvers, and engineers should take a stand. For example, you may decide that ASCE, the civil engineers, have taken a good example in their infrastructure policies. And there's also an AIA example. And it was noted in our discussion that you can't shut down all natural gas plants tomorrow because the grid would collapse. You've got to recognize the need for a transition. And finally, most importantly, engineers to be engaged with public policymakers. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Bob. All right. Thank you, everyone. Again, you know, in these settings, we never have enough time to really, you know, move then to a whole group discussion of what we've learned. Appreciate the report out that each of the groups gave with regard to, you know, key things in your discussion. We will have the ability, and we will go back through the notes that you've taken as we begin to synthesize and put together what were some of the common themes and important points that came out of our work together in terms of leveraging that group genius. So that's work ahead for Mike and I and others that may be involved in that. With that, I'd like to take another short break. And then after that break, we're going to have a period where we can run through the tape. It'll begin with moving to our fifth provocateur, Thelma Briseno, and a focus there which we want to pick up and recognize, the work ahead with regard to dealing with climate change needs to be done within the context of that notion of social and environmental justice. And she'll be able to highlight work that her organization and that she's involved with addressing those particular things. So right now I've got 10 after the hour. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back into that presentation and provocation by Thelma. Thank you very much.
They're connected, but you can't tell they're sitting there, right?
That's correct.
I'll give it 30 seconds and then we're going to move. Okay, so let's go and get started. We wanted to, acknowledge that, again, as I said prior to the break, you can work on climate change and see it as an engineering challenge and get distracted from the context that as we do, as we implement these changes to our technological systems that can have different results with regard to our use of carbon and building a, an adaptive environment, et cetera, we do it within the context of people, real people, and the communities, that constitute our society. And we can recognize that there are times in the past where we've used technologies in ways that have resulted in situations where the results weren't just from a racial or environmental equity standpoint. And that moving forward, it's not just a matter of addressing climate change per se. We need to do it within the context of trying to both heal situations from the past, but to do it as well in a way that makes a positive difference in the future with regard to social and environmental justice. And so that's where we want to go next. With Thelma Briseno, she works with Climate Resolve, which is a nonprofit. She's working down in the Los Angeles basin area in terms of the work that she's doing. She's their director of energy and water programs, though she comes to that work as an engineer, both from an environmental and civil side. And I will highlight, one of the things that we talked about moving into this program is that to solve this problem and to deal effectively with climate change is going to take contributions from government, the private sector, but also importantly, it's going to take a contribution, meaningful contribution from the nonprofit sector. There's important work that's being done by the nonprofit sector, and engineers need to be able to work with each of those groups and to integrate and form coalitions and integrate that work as a whole. So really pleased to have Thelma with us to both talk about the social justice component of dealing with climate change, but also as a representative of that nonprofit voice. So with that, Thelma, I'll turn it over to you and let you pull up your slides.
Great. Let's see here. Okay. Great. I think I'm sharing. Is that
Yes.
good? Okay, wonderful. Okay, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm just going to move some things around here. So yes, thank you for having me. I am an engineer originally from the Midwest. I've been working in California since about 2013. And as Kyle said, I've been invited here today to provide a tangible example about how the engineering community and the planning community can make a meaningful impact on people in vulnerable and frontline communities. So I'm just going to talk with you about a couple of things today, just my organization overall and what exactly we do, why we do it,
and how we do it, and then provide you with a case study overview of a multi-benefit project that we are calling the Merced Avenue Greenway. Merced Avenue is located in a small Los Angeles County municipality called South El Monte. But first I want to tell you a little bit about me and sort of my path and how I got to engineering. I have a bachelor's degree in environmental science from the University of Toledo in Ohio, graduated in 2000. After which I worked the environmental health compliance field, both at the city, county, and state levels for the Ohio Department of Health, very public health focused. But I had always sort of been dialed into the activism movement, and especially as it pertained to community development, but specifically urban sustainable redevelopment. So after about 11 years of working professionally, I decided that in order to make a more meaningful impact, I really needed to know more. I needed more of a tool belt that was equipped with sort of like more technical knowledge. So I went back to school, and with the moral support of a few dynamic and super intelligent female engineers at the University of Toledo, I completed the undergrad and master degree requirements for a civil and environmental engineering degree. So knowing that California, as we've been talking about today, has been a leader in environmental policy, I moved here to Southern California in 2013 and have been working sustainability consulting, more specifically green building consulting for new construction. But as you can imagine, I was definitely missing that community development spark. So during my time at the various consulting firms, I had done some project management work for Climate Resolve on their energy efficiency projects in schools. So the Climate Resolve executive director, Mr. Jonathan Parfrey, heard I was looking for more fulfilling work. So he brought me on in 2017 to manage their Climate Smart Schools program. So Climate Resolve, but they were founded in 2010. And what we do is we aim to provide localized solutions to a very global problem. We do this by connecting communities, organizations, and policymakers. And we use this connection to develop practical initiatives that reduce climate pollution and prepare local communities for climate impacts. Thus, we are collectively creating a thriving California, hopefully. So our purpose really is a just and equitable and resilient future. So in California, climate change disproportionately impacts under-resourced communities that policymakers characterize as disadvantaged communities, or DACs. The residents of these communities are predominantly Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC people. And since our launch in 2010, our work really has been to do three things: to advocate in partnership with grassroots groups, assisting communities to obtain funding for climate solutions, and just to ensure an equitable implementation of climate legislation. So everyone at Climate Resolve, the staff, have identified and made personal commitments to elevate racial, social, and environmental equity throughout everything that we do. So in addition to myself, Climate Resolve Collective is comprised of planning and transportation professionals, business development professionals, as well as NGO development professionals. And then of course, technical and communication specialists. In our recent past, Climate Resolve successfully led 2 policies through state and local legislature. Proposition 39, or the California Clean Energy Jobs Act, which passed in 2012. And this initiative, what it did is it closed a tax loophole that redirected funds to state-funded K through 12 schools, as well as community colleges, for very much needed energy efficiency upgrades. And the other policy was in the city of Los Angeles, their Cool Roof Ordinance, which was implemented in 2013. This mandated new and refurbished roofs to have a minimum solar reflectance of 0.2. And it also provided homeowners and business owners with incentive from the local utility, Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. The incentive was to replace existing roof shingles and tiles with cool roof materials. So both of these successes back in the day were big for Climate Resolve, and it really just led to a better collaborations, but it also highlighted how much work was needed in our local Los Angeles communities. So we have a lot of resiliency projects and collaborative cohorts happening that also touch on workforce development in various places. But for the sake of time, if you go to our website, climateresolve.org, you'll see that our work is really categorized by these five different areas: urban cooling, transportation, communities, wildfires, and smart growth. And I would suggest looking at our 2020 impact report. If you go to climateresolve.org, it's located under the About Us tab, and that will tell you a little bit more detail about our current work. But you know, the movement of our work is generally categorized by three different paths. The first path would be stakeholder engagement and policy watchdogging, you know, with the larger community. And then the second path would be outreach directly to frontline community members and residents, business owners as well, and to other community-based organizations, smaller than Climate Resolve. And then the third path would be project implementation, so which really brings it all together and brings me to this project. One of our current projects is called the Merced Avenue Greenway. And it is a 1.1 mile corridor located in the city of South El Monte. This location was called out in the city's 2010 corridor revitalization plan. And the revitalization plan really aimed to, they really wanted to calm traffic down and improve public safety on this particular street in general. Then in 2017, the nonprofit partners listed here, the Council for Watershed Health, Active SGV, and Climate Resolve. We submitted for a design grant to the Coastal Conservancy that addressed their traffic and safety concerns. And it also addressed stormwater concerns and climate resiliency concerns. And so historically, this area has been predominantly industrial, mainly focusing on, mainly for aerospace machine shops and the like. And several family-owned shops remain in the area, and they've been there since the 1950s. All were extremely nice, and when we talked with them, they provided great anecdotal stories about the changing land use in the area and also about environmental pollution. The groundwater and some of the soils in the area have been designated as a US EPA Superfund site for multiple responsible parties involved, of course. So protecting the groundwater, improving soils was paramount, not just to the city of South El Monte, but of course the residents and all the nonprofit partners. But the current land use, of course, it's been changing since the 50s. The current land use is a mix of industrial and residential. The 46% of the Greenway is currently industrial or semi-industrial, and it's located in the northern part of the corridor. And the southern part of the corridor is residential, 36% multifamily and 18% single family. This, of course, is a working class community And through the transition from predominantly an industrial area to the residential area, it's really left the residents void of green space, which has increased urban heat and left residents dealing with, and business owners dealing with years of accumulated pollution. So here we have a map of the area, and the stormwater treatment train will manage 100% of an 85th percentile 24-hour storm event. And to do this, we are using permeable pavement along the curbs and gutters throughout the corridor, even in the parking areas. And then once the permeable pavement is saturated, excessive water flow will be diverted through the gutters and into planting areas and larger bioretention areas. The water table here is, it's kind of wonky. It starts at 45 feet at the northern end of Merced, and then it shallows out to about 6 feet at the southern end. So we really had to be strategic about where we were placing the planting areas and the bioretention areas along the corridor. And then the third line of defense is a high infiltration media biofiltration areas. Times fast. So there's 8 of these, and we're placing them at street corners to capture larger and to capture and to treat larger flows of water before it enters into the storm drain. And then the storm drain enters into a lake. It's called Leg Lake. It's in Whittier Narrows, a park just located south of the corridor, and that's indicated by the green space there. But really, this is just the tip of the park space. So, and here you see an aerial photo of Leg Lake and Whittier Narrows. And the other 2 photos are of very long bike paths. They're very cool, that go through very large portions of Los Angeles County. And they both run through Whittier Narrows, the San Gabriel bike path, which I believe is about 28 miles long, and the Rio Hondo bike path, which is about 17 miles long. So Merced Avenue will connect South El Monte to both of these bike trails and provide access to more much needed green space. So it's super important for us to safely connect South El Monte residents to these resource areas. And before we started surface designs, the team conducted extensive community outreach to residents and business owners alike. And we also conducted 3 design charrette type events. And then the community outreach activities included survey development in 4 different languages: English, Spanish, Cantonese, and Mandarin. And we were able to collect about 150 surveys. A website development, there you see mercedavenuegreenway.org. And we conducted walking audits and bike street audits. We also led a Santa Ana bike tour. Santa Ana is a nearby city that has a similar green street that's already been constructed. We've led focus groups with the local youth, and then we also conducted one-on-one meetings with residents and business owners. And so at the design charrette, community members were able to vocalize their concerns generally at the very first meeting. And then they were able to view the various designs and ask questions at the second and third meetings. Their concerns mainly lied around slowing down traffic and bike path safety, not losing precious parking, which was difficult to incorporate into the design. And the businesses wanted reassurance that their day-to-day would not be interrupted. So here you see the 3 designs that we presented. Design A is an elevated and protected bike path at the same level of the sidewalk. B is a bike lane at the same level of the road, protected by striping. And bike lane C is striped out between parking spaces and the car travel lanes. So here's the final design. That's, of course, just a mock-up, but it includes an elevated and protected bike path. It incorporates the permeable pavers and planting areas and the bioretention areas. And we're also addressing urban heat and protecting sensitive groundwater and improving soils. And so the project team, we continue to work through this, even though the design grant has been depleted. But we're working with the city of South El Monte to apply for grant funding that will supplement construction costs. But I think it's safe to say that construction on the southern portion of the corridor will begin either late this summer or early fall, and it will be completed in 2023. And we're hoping that the construction of the north portion of the corridor will start in 2022. And that's it. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Thelma. Yeah, we've got a couple minutes for questions. I might just ask you, Thelma. It seems to me that one of the things that on the project that happens, and I wonder if this is, really representative of the work that you and Climate Resolve do, is you take, one small thing, traffic engineering, or we're going to traffic calm this corridor, and see your role as how do you look at the bigger opportunities to go back and address underlying conditions and things that can happen. Is that really part of your work, is to push that envelope that way?
Yes, definitely. Multi-benefit projects are very attractive, not just to state and federal funding partners, but to private investment partners also. I think there really is, it's the only way to address a lot of these very sensitive, ecologically sensitive areas where people have been, residing and doing business, for a very long time. So they're very much a part of, they're front and center really in the work that we do. And so in order to do that correctly, they all have to be multi-benefit projects.
All right, any other questions?
Thelma, it's Mike. In your community outreach, did the community appreciate the heat island impacts and the stormwater impacts as much as they did the other things they were concerned about?
Yes, it's extremely hot in the valley here in Los Angeles. So, and there are a lot of avid bikers in the area. So in order to enjoy the outdoors, and they really needed, there's no way you cannot address urban heat and urban heat island. The project will also be monitoring urban UHI throughout the entire project. We started at the beginning. George Van Weiss is the engineering lead at USC. And so him and his grad students will be closely monitoring UHI temperatures, surface temperatures, and ambient temperatures throughout the entire project. And stormwater also. Some of these stories from these old machine shop owners were a little hard to listen to. So I mean, it's since the 50s, it's been a lot of aerospace in the area. So there's been a lot of pollution.
All right. Just a quick question from Libby Jones. She asks, do you use any rating system like Envision to help promote your projects?
No, I don't know what Envision is, actually.
Okay.
You have to educate me.
Libby, do you want to just comment on that real quick?
Please.
Either Libby or Anthony Kane from the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure.
Yeah, I was going to say, if we've got somebody from ISI on here, they might do a better job than me.
Okay, Anthony?
Sure. So Envision is a rating system for infrastructure in much the same way that LEED is a rating system for building. And so it's applied for a lot of horizontal infrastructure across the US.
Okay. I'll look into it. That's interesting.
All right. With that, I'm going to wrap up that segment. Thank you, Thelma. And I think that notion, how do we take each of the opportunities that we have and see what's the bigger set of possibilities around it in terms of addressing, issues of resilience, adaptation, social justice, environmental justice from that perspective. All right, last piece of work that we want to do today is to come to a question that came up in a couple of the reports coming out of that second exercise. And so the instructions for looking at this, let me pull up my workbook and get to the right page. Hold on just one second. And we want to put you into the exercise which asks this question of you: is there a noble purpose that could be conceived, that the engineering community could adopt, that would help do real work in help pulling not just the engineering community, but the broader constituency, the broader community toward solutions to this climate challenge that we all face. Let me just share this very quick, and then we'll get you into the small groups. So in each of the groups, again, you'll be given a brief statement like this to work on in terms of developing your thing. We'll put you into about a dozen small groups. Each of your groups, you're going to have. I'm going to give you, what did I say, Mike? 20 minutes? No, it's less than that. Let's do 15 minutes in your small groups.
Okay.
And Mike, you can make that adjustment with regard to time.
Yes.
Instead of the 25, we're going to do, we'll get you to do this as a lightning round. But the basic question to answer is, based on our work in today's summit, prepare a draft noble purpose statement for engineers in the engineering community with respect to the grand challenge of climate change. So this is less about should there be one, and just accept that we're saying there should be. And what would that look like if there was one from your small group's perspective? And be ready to report out that in 15 minutes. All right, with that, we're going to move you into small groups. Good luck crafting that noble purpose statement. Oh, and I stopped share. For this report out, we don't have a huge amount of time. So what I'd like to do is offer the opportunity for groups. Well, no, we'll go through, but for each of the groups, if you've got a longer statement, try and pull one piece of it out that you think is particularly significant. We'll have the opportunity of looking back through your whole statement in the workbook. So you don't have to read the whole statement, but really just try, noble purpose. There was actually a nonprofit that worked in, with regard to disability stuff, and their noble purpose was captured in 2 words: to defy disability, as what they do. So this is the point where what was the most concise version of what you talked about in your group, recognizing we'll have the opportunity to go back and mine and look at all that you offered in the workbook that you did as a write-up. So with that burden in mind, we're going to go to group 1 to start us off, and I appreciate it's always harder being the first group to report out and establish the pattern. So group 1.
Yeah, it's hard to cut this to a few words, really, because every word's pretty good. I'll try my best here. Engineers need to take a multifaceted approach to the issue of climate change through educating the general public, collaborating, and also showcase the benefit and the possibilities of overcoming the obstacles of climate change to the community.
All right, very nicely done. Not too, but still pretty concise. So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, John. Group 2.
Okay, so our statement was the engineering community is committed and proactively leads in the communication exchange among all stakeholders, both public and private, as well as remaining committed to social justice and environmental justice aspects through all of our work.
All right. Thank you. Good work. Group 3.
Sure. Assert our leadership as stewards of the nexus of the environment and our built communities. Use our skills and systems thinking to move beyond understanding the science to implement our design solutions and effectively communicate the benefits.
All right, thank you, Dirk. Group 4.
Hi, this is Jennifer. We have a long list, but I'll just summarize it. We need to ensure society addresses the global imperatives, and engineers can do that, and include the diverse voices and perspectives and living systems. It isn't just humans, it's also our animal friends and plant friends. We need to influence social justice, and this needs to be aspirational. It needs to make our dreams come true in order to be at the level to motivate change. And then if not us, the engineers, then who is actually going to do this?
Right. Thank you, Jennifer.
Mm-hmm.
Group 5.
Okay, this is Dan. Our statement was, we embrace our responsibility to the global community by leading change locally and urgently to address the causes and impacts of climate change.
Nice. Thank you, Daniel. All right, group 6.
Ours is long, but I'll make it short. Engineers are ethically charged to play a crucial role in these objectives and are called to be better than ever and be courageous in seeking new solutions.
Excellent. And Ken, you were group 6?
Yes, sir.
I just lost track. I'm sorry. Okay, group 7.
So we came up with engineers will save the world. Join us.
All right. Defy disability. There you go. Okay. Group 8.
Hi, it's Amy. The engineering community affirms its commitment to drive and lead global collaboration for climate change solutions through innovation and education of our local communities in a socially equitable way.
All right, thank you, Amy. Group 9.
This is Gil. The noble purpose of the engineering community and the grand challenge of climate change is to embrace a leadership role, taking responsibility for creating the vision and crafting the policies that will serve to inspire future generations of engineers to make positive impacts on society beyond the mere technical aspects.
Thank you, Gil. Group 10.
Wrote, influence the development and implementation of technology, infrastructure, and policies that benefit the community and environment while enhancing the human experience and understanding life cycle impact.
All right, thanks, Mike. Group 11.
Hi, this is Scott. I had to step off the call, and when I got back on, I had this roll. So
that always happens.
It always happens, yes. Engineers will lead the way by collaborating across disciplines and the diversity of the broader society by embracing technology to deliver innovative solutions. We will act as trusted partners to help all stakeholders better understand the risks and challenges of action and inaction. Our professional standard of care will be the guide in finding equitable solutions and in considering the effects on the environment, stakeholders, and the economy.
Thanks, Scott. And bringing us home, Group 12.
All right, we cut down our 40-page manifesto to, regarding the grand challenge of climate change, we the engineers pledge to take a worldwide leadership role in connecting communities, organizations, policymakers, fostering a culture of ethics, stewardship, social responsibility, and innovation in education, government, industry, and across society.
All right, very good. So here's a question for the group, and we'll try and watch for hands up, but also if you can unmute yourself and speak. Should there be this type of noble purpose adopted by the engineering community? Yeah, you can put emojis up in your. We can see the number of emojis, but more than nodding heads now. Someone speak to that. Well, if you're nodding your head, what are your thoughts there?
Our group actually discussed this where, I mean, it's really an ethical imperative and something to inspire the future generations of engineers. When we talked about the need to get more people involved at STEM at an early age, giving the profession this noble purpose, I think is what will inspire people to choose this path.
Others?
I thought that was a great statement. It's about, there's a role to take. Without us, it's not going to be nearly as good. And we have to be much better at what we've always traditionally done and create a whole new generation, an army of highly capable people who can contribute and interact and advocate and educate and do all the things that are maybe non-traditional engineering roles.
Thanks, John. Others, your thoughts about should there be this type of, should the engineering community embrace this type of noble purpose with regard to climate change?
I think definitely. I look at what EWB's statement, it's kind of in and out over the years, but building a better world, one community at a time. I mean, that strikes so many of our young students coming into engineering, and they gravitate toward it right away without even really knowing what it is, just because of that statement. So I think some type of noble purpose is really important for us to have a statement like that.
Others?
It seems to me it's absolutely.
Okay. Greg, go ahead.
I was just going to say that kind of statement I think is really important for us as a group. What we're trying to do is galvanize entire communities and countries to work together, right? And so the engineering community should have a statement of purpose that galvanizes us as well.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Who was the other person that was?
Yeah, it was Charlie. I'd just say, I know we're talking specific to climate change, but I know we've talked many times in the past that if we don't take a more of a leadership, noble role, that, we've experienced where our efforts get commoditized, and we want to avoid that from happening, not just with climate change, but just our overall practice.
Others?
We want to give a public or community a new image that engineering community is working for a purpose, not just for making a living or be a professional.
All right, good. Anybody else?
Yeah, this is Jennifer. Hi. I think that, the idea of the noble purpose is, a unifying action that could keep the principles of, all the work that we do, keep in the forefront of our mind that, when we're doing our jobs, there's an added need on top of everything we do to ensure that we are being, sustainable and climate change, not climate change impacting and things like that. So I think that a noble cause kind of a statement like that could unify, in interesting ways to make different decisions occur.
So here's a different sort of aspect to it. If there's a sense broadly held that it would be a good thing to the extent that the engineering community would have this sort of noble purpose with regard to climate change, what should keeping in mind that the Engineering Change Lab, US, has been set up not to duplicate good work being done by other members of the engineering community, associations or societies or other groups like that. What's your sense of what the Engineering Change Lab should be doing with regard to helping facilitate or helping move forward this idea of the engineering community having this type of noble purpose? Any thoughts on that?
So speaking as a non-engineer who works with engineers and who's tasked with the policy aspect of all of this, I think, and also just thinking about some of the coalitions that NSPE is already a part of and the things that they do, the one piece that's missing and that I heard people talk about a lot today is the engineer as the voice, the one who's speaking up and sharing expertise. NSPE is part of a couple of other coalitions that focus on resilience, and a lot of that focus is around processes and regulatory issues and things like that. But I'm not aware of any organization or coalition that's working to empower engineers to be that voice, to know how to communicate, or to provide opportunities to do everything from public testimony in a state legislature to an op-ed or something like that. So I think that public speaking or that public voice is the part that seems to be missing, unless other people know things that I don't, which is entirely possible.
All right, thank you, Stephanie.
I think, the Engineering Change Lab is kind of just that. It's a lab. We got a lot of smart people here from a lot of different areas. And we've obviously been brainstorming this today, and we've come up with some really good noble causes that are pretty much all in the same realm. And it's kind of like, okay, now that we've done that, let's go out to our respective groups, whether it's ACEC or the PE Society or academia, and kind of spread the good word on that of this is what we think we should be doing, and get them on board to spread that noble cause and get on board with it, because that's the way it's going to spread. It's going to be one engineer at a time, pretty much.
All right, thanks, Paul.
Pat, Natali has his hand up. Pat, go ahead.
Yeah, Pat.
Yes, this is an interesting issue. We've struggled in the engineering profession forever, trying to work together. Every time we meet, we create a new group, and the new group goes off and does their own thing, which is great. But the thing is, we don't have that mass audience to get together. We tried to do it through AAES for a long time. That didn't work. It struggled for many years. I'm hopeful that the Engineering Change Lab will help fill that gap. How do we bring the engineering community together with a common voice to go out and make a difference? We go on the Hill, ASME does their Hill visits, ASCE does their Hill visits, ACEC does their Hill visits. And we're all small groups going there. And I think we have minimum impact. I've always had a vision of someday we get a body together and we go to the Hill with 10,000 engineers, or even 1,000 engineers. We can make a difference. We're all small voices and we're not heard, and we go through the same thing. So maybe the Engineering Change Lab, I'm optimistic, can make the difference and bring us together collectively to challenge the decision makers to do what we think is best. And I think we have a lot of the answers. We talked about it the last couple of meetings that I've attended. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Others?
Dave Sokip here. We did sort of a coalition with a number of societies. Essentially, it's maybe developing a position statement that then in turn goes out to all of the engineering societies and have the various societies buy into it, and sort of set up this coalition. I think there's something similar to Stephanie. I think NSPE is involved with the on the importance of licensure, that you've gotten groups together. So organizations that are can buy into this, they can choose not to, but at least coming up with a position and then sending it out to our respective societies to see if they buy into it. And Pat, then maybe we could get those numbers that collectively we've got hundreds of thousands of engineers behind the statement.
Well, we're kind of, Mike, I'm wondering, in terms of moving forward and next steps. And, I think exactly right, Dave, out of the Licensure Summit, we've got next steps moving out of that. And again, not that the Change Lab is trying to get in the middle as much as facilitating contributions from NCEES and others with regard to how to do those things. I wonder if here, you know, and Mike, asking your opinion, could we establish like an initiative team coming out of this session and ask for, if you will, volunteers from people that are, you know, with us in this session, if you're interested in this, and that initiative team to take a shot at drafting, you know, given the possibilities that were presented out of these 12 groups, some sort of synthesis of, you know, this purpose statement, but also think about how that could be communicated out, just as Dave has suggested, to other groups that we're networked with, to see what, you know, to see their reactions and also thoughts about how that could move forward. What do you think about that, Mike?
Well, as we planned for this session, by the way, are you hearing me? Because my mic died. Are you hearing me, Kyle? Okay.
Yes.
As we planned for this session, we were open to the possibility that there might be an interest in moving ahead with some sort of joint statement. So yes, I agree that that we should not let this die. And if this interests you, and please reach out to me. And in particular, you know, we have a number of leaders of societies, other societies and organizations involved here. And I will proactively reach out to all of those people and engage the interest from making this an inter-society or inter-organizational effort. So yes, reach out to me if you would like to be part of that moving forward.
Excellent. All right, folks, with that, we are approaching, you know, the end of our scheduled session. You know, I appreciate your willingness to hang in for 5.5 hours. That's a long period on Zoom, and to contribute with regard to the group exercises we've done. As well, from my perspective, just to thank the provocateurs and the great contributions that each of them made with regard to this work. Mike, do you have some closing thoughts that you want to share?
Yeah, let me do that. I'll just echo what Kyle said. Thank you to all of you for taking part in this discussion of this important topic. And Kyle, again, thank you for your leadership of the group. I did want to just take the opportunity to let everybody know about our upcoming events, which are on the screen. It starts with another virtual open house, which is in the spirit of continuing the conversation. So look for an email from me with details on that. Our next summit, Summit 12, is scheduled for June and will focus on the engineering firm of the future. And the two primary themes for that summit are shown on the slide. First, we're going to look at how the external landscape within which firms operate may be shaped by societal, economic, environmental, and technological driving forces. And one possible framing for that would be the risks that the clients of engineering firms face in the future, which we looked at early in today's summit. We will also focus on the workforce of the future and consider how the values of the next generation of engineers will shape firms in the future, particularly values with respect to environmental issues and social challenges like racial equality. So to provide background for that discussion, we are working on a two-pronged data gathering exercise. In April, we will have a series of focus groups for professionals at different levels of experience. And the second phase will be an online survey that we're working with Arizona State University on. And if you're interested in learning more about this research, again, contact me. And hopefully these topics will be of interest, even if you are not part of a private sector engineering. And then in October, we hope to return to in-person events with the second edition of the Engineering Ideas Institute. We are scheduled to hold that at the Colorado Chautauqua in Boulder. And this is a great historic venue located right at the foot of the mountains in Colorado. There's limited on-site housing available. So if you're interested in an early reservation, please contact me about the housing for that. And again, look for more information in the coming weeks. So we will continue our exploration of the important questions about the future of engineering. And we hope you will stay engaged in our work, and feel free to contact me with any questions or comments. And look tomorrow for an email with a survey about today's summit. So thank you again for your participation today, and enjoy the rest of the week.